The next coming of the Roman legion and first steps to build an empire. Durandon's POV. Introducing, or at least reinforcing, concepts into the fantasy equivalent of the Middle Ages would prove to be somewhat challenging. Yet, with how society seemed to respect the words and ideas of those in power, it wasn't completely impossible for a crown prince to do it. Especially since I had Tywin to make sure that none would make light of my authority. When discussing the technological progress of his world, George R. Martin stated that the unpredictable nature of the seasonal changes and the harshness of the winters must play a role. I do think that magic perhaps makes development of the scientific method less likely. If men can fly by means of a spell, do you ever get the Wright brothers, Santos Dumont? Or even Da Vinci? An interesting question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. Well, the seasons have changed since my arrival and magic hasn't been a thing for centuries. The Maesters, an order of scholars, healers, messengers, and scientists, educate new students at their seat, the Citadel, which was located in Aldtown, a city in the Reach. Sometimes called the Knights of the Mind, boys and young men from all over Westeros approach them to study, learn, and forge their chains at the Citadel. Novices, students who have yet to earn their first link, and acolytes, students who have earned at least one link of their chain, are educated together in similar fashion to the apprentices and acolytes of the Alchemist Guild. Archmaesters gave open lectures, which the students could attend at will, since they had the freedom to pursue whatever field they wanted to. Once a student believes he has sufficient knowledge on a particular subject, he can go before an Archmaester to demonstrate his knowledge. And if the Archmaester judges the student's knowledge to be proficient, he awards him with a link of a medal reflecting the topic. The likes of Qyburn comments that it was merely a reproduction of knowledge, nothing new was being discovered. Once a student has earned sufficient links, he could forge his chain and take his maester's vow, after which the Citadel might relocate him, serving at a castle advising lords on the operation of their households and lands. Some lords trust their maesters to open and read letters and to convey their contents to them, while other lords preferred to do so for themselves. Maesters could also be tasked with writing letters for their lords as well, and might be trusted to read and write the letters of those lords who were illiterate. They were in charge of the ravens used as messengers. Which made me paranoid of sending letters with sensitive information, even if Pycelle was more loyal to House Lannister than to the Order of the Maesters. Maesters in general assisted in childbirth, treatment of illnesses, and taught children arithmetic, language and history. They were basically everywhere worthy of their services. Sadly, I don't believe it would be wise to trust them to serve me even after I present myself capable of performing magic. I am a strong believer that the Maesters, perhaps alongside other factions like the Faceless Men, had been seeking to get rid of magic and rule the world through logic alone. I didn't blame them, but neither did I count on the possibility of convincing them to change their mind. For that instance, I intended to shape my alchemists as the next coming of the Maesters, regardless if they came before. But currently, my wisdoms weren't capable of competing, much less replacing the Order of Maesters, so I would have another faction aiding them on this mission. And that will be the Faith of the Seven. Just hear me out first. The Great Sept of Baelor, the large sept of the Faith of the Seven atop Visonya's Hill in King's Landing, was a preeminent center of religious education in the realm. Even in my previous world, faith has had an historical contribution to the spread of knowledge, even if it was used as a bargaining chip to secure more devotees. Regardless of that, everyone that read the books or watched the TV series knows that most religions in Planetos seem to actually carry some real supernatural powers. The old gods had wargs and greenseers, R'hllor had fortune-telling priests and deadly shadow babies, the drowned god seems to be all about the dead coming back to life and creatures of the sea rising from their deep abyss. But what about the seven? So far, these new gods have yet to show to their followers that they have any real power at all. The warriors' sons were said to have been holy men, ascetics, sorcerers, dragon slayers and demon hunters. But folk nowadays assume it was merely stuff of legends. Through being anointed a knight and cleric, I've acquired titles that gave me the opportunity to meet said pantheon. This made me wonder incessantly if anyone anointed by me would have a similar experience. In any case, I just needed to subtly introduce the idea of magic being a gift and a blessing from the gods, or at least come to accept and worship the sort of magic I was capable of performing. This should prevent people from labeling me as a cursed individual wielding blasphemous powers. Instead, I would be the next coming of Baelor the Blessed, performing miracles and supporting the faith. If nothing else, walk barefoot in the smoldering sands of Dorne during the summer, bare-chested in the harsh winters of the north and swim in the storming waters of Shipbreakers Bay. Now, for the actual improvement I was considering bringing to this world. Already known concepts like metal and glass working or agricultural techniques could be improved to become more effective with simple alterations. This would imply achieving better quality in less time and with lower costs. Not to mention, the Westerlands were no stranger to metallurgy, and its southern portion had the fertile soil of the Reach. Windmills and waterwheels weren't that much of an oddity in the most populous and wealthy areas like the Reach or the Riverlands, so I could use and abuse them. Dyes, perfumes, soaps, oil lanterns, mirrors and glasses could be more commonly found in the free cities of Essos, which thankfully had its noticeable presence in Lannisport's docks and market as well. Masonry allowed space for bridge building at the level of the Twins, road making that was more primitive than the one made by the Valyrian's dragonlords, and mining tunneling that deployed an extensive tunnel and drain system deep underground, seen in both King's Landing and Castle Rock. That would be key to achieve the same level of ingenuity the Romans had employed through roads, aqueducts, arches to build structures, development of concrete, hypocaust system, plumbing and sanitary management. In Westeros, medical treatments were most frequently given by the maesters of the citadel, which were actually more advanced than real-life medieval medical knowledge. And even local healers, midwives, hedge wizards or wood witches served the purpose of treating the small folk. Through my studies, I've come to learn that the healing arts included potions capable of dulling the pain, like milk of the poppy or dream wine, and potions that either prevented pregnancy or induced abortions, like moon tea. Though there wasn't any medicine that didn't have some sort of side effects like propensity to addiction or long-term health issues, I was still interested in making it work. Wounds were often cleaned with boiling wine or treated with Myrish fire or fire milk, while maggots might be used to eat out rotten parts. Maesters had also learned to stitch wounds close and how to use poultices to prevent infection. To that I have my alchemists working with a batch of my experimental elixirs. Last I checked on them, they were near cracking down the most reliable way of replenishing their ingredients storage to mass produce it. Even if my alchemists succeeded in mass producing my minor healing potions, I would definitely call it an astounding progress. Interestingly enough, Shade of the Evening, also called the Wine of Warlocks, was a noticeable catalyst to make the brewing process faster. Which I had already deducted would be the case for the mana restoring potion I had in mind after gaining the potion of ultimate mana from my second dungeon delving's loot. Same thing could be said about the weirwood paste Bloodraven had the children of the forest prepare for him, in order to use during Bran's training as a greenseer. Since getting my hands on such magical ingredients and recipes would be easier said than done, I still had my eyes set on securing the mana refueling infusion first. Back to scientific and technological matters, even astronomy wasn't such a far-fetched topic for me to explore. Given that my basic understanding of divination magic had already made me aware of their correlation, as well as my allegiance to both the new and old gods. Myrish eyes mounted on tripods were already used to observe the stars. At some locations, dedicated observatories could be found, at Winterfell. The maesters of the Citadel must have compiled several maps of the starry sky for their research and studies, especially since their knowledge would be useful in navigation at the open sea. The names of constellations could differ between cultural groups. For example, the constellation known by the people of the Seven Kingdoms as the King's Crown was called the Cradle by the free folk living north of the Wall, while they called the Stallion the Horned Lord. I personally had reservations about adventuring the seas and the skies with my game system constantly mentioning extraplanar creatures. But being prepared to face danger was always preferable than remaining safely ignorant. Overall, Westeros had a deep mythic and historic legacy recounted in songs, stories and literature. Not only did these tales recount the epics of legendary heroes and romances, but they also retell romantic-ised history and fables of fantastic creatures. And to my surprise, books, scrolls, parchment and paper were of common use in this society of mostly illiterate people. Though not anywhere near the level modern society used to in my previous life. In this world, no recorded society had ever made mention of printing presses or even woodblock printing, which opened up space for an opportunity to be explored. Bard, one of my aliases, had already made a good impression as a storyteller and artist, so through him I would be safe to spread some of my previous life's successful hits without major repercussions to my image. On the other hand, several numerous units of measurement have been recorded. The Westerosi measurement units were mostly non-metric, growing out of customary use and not abstract principles. The Seven Kingdoms seemed to have a uniform system of weights and measures though. There were several basic units of measurement that were in usage: length, weight, area, volume and time. Additionally, some units of measurements commonly used were admittedly more archaic in their usage, e.g. the term stone, to indicate weight, and the term league, to indicate distance. If I was allowed to have my way, I would certainly attempt to introduce the metric system while also labeling it with an awesome name such as imperial unit. For currency, coins were the manner used most frequently, especially by merchants, owners of establishments, and the noble classes. Small folk mostly made use of copper coins or simply barter. Thus far, no society in Westeros or Essos has been recorded as using paper currency, which also gave space to opportunity. Most societies used currency in the form of coins made from precious metals such as gold, silver, or copper, with a few notable exceptions, such as the iron coins used in Bravos. Contracts written on parchment or paper could also be accepted, though these were not currency as such. For example, when the Brotherhood without banners during the War of the Five Kings gave commoners notes promising to pay them for supplies they took after the war ended. An idea I certainly could make use of for my legion during times of unrest, which would be a better incentive to have the small folk not collaborate with rebels and criminals. Similarly, in the books, Tyrion drew up contracts promising to pay the second sons with gold from Castle Rock in return for their aid in restoring him to his lordship. Which was much more effective if the ones signing contracts had a long and respectable reputation of paying their debts. Which was something Bronn didn't understand at all. I will never understand why the hell did the TV show writers think that making him Master of Coin and ruling Lord of Highgarden was a reasonable idea. Dumb and dumber indeed. Besides the Lannisters of Lannisport, other distant kin living in the city were the Lannys, Lannettes, and Lantels, many of whom had the characteristic blonde hair of Lan the Clever. Though none were anything more than small merchant families. As for the ancient branch of House Lannister of Castle Rock, I've met another inconsistency with the main source material. For the most part, House Lannister of Lannisport had barely been differentiated other than their speculated origin, but what was stranger to me was that a segment of House Lannister was now ruling Lannisport. Sir Stafford Lannister should be a knight of House Lannister, good brother to the Warden of the West as his sister, Lady Joanna, married their cousin, Lord Tywin Lannister. But somehow, he was now the ruling Lord of Lannisport. Don't get me wrong, between Jon Arryn having a daughter before his engagement with Lisa Tully and Jaime Lannister rescuing Rhaenys Targaryen, this could easily be mistaken as an unimportant footnote. Jaime and Cersei lineage. Hell, even Bronn's background was more significant than changing who ruled Lannisport. In any way, since winter had finally come once again, I had my plans currently restricted to visiting Lannisport. So having someone like Lord Stafford openly welcoming me to his city was a good start. With winters being harsher than they had ever been before my birth, most lords were too busy to properly do my bidding. The same could be said for Lord Stafford, but the man at least had the courtesy of assigning his son to guide me around town. My prince, the young man bowed to me and acknowledged my companions as I entered his residence, having Tyrion and Sandor following me as my undead knight pretended to be my knight persona, equipped with a better set of armor. It's an honor to have you here. As Sandor rolled his eyes in annoyance and Tyrion gave out a smirk, I thanked the young noble's hospitality. I'm thankful for the welcoming, and please, call me Durandon. I will do. Davin rose up, his height around 2 heads higher than mine. He was 16 years old, with lively hazel eyes, a pug nose, yellow hair and a big chin. So, you've come to get a tour out of my father's city. He spoke casually, almost making an 180, without sounding disrespectful. Indeed, if it's not a bother, I would very much appreciate a proper tour of it. Besides, I've been wondering about how different the market here would be to the one at King's Landing. I replied, thinking about what could actually be done in such a casual visit as the temperature continued to drop. Sure thing, Durandon, the son of Lord Stafford replied. My father has reserved a carriage to help us out with that endeavor. I'm sure we aren't as big as the capital city, but I can guarantee you that we compensate with quality. Oh, then you also have a blacksmith capable of reworking Valyrian steel, excellent. I remarked jokingly, testing Davin's personality as Tyrion gave out an amused look. Well, hey, okay, I don't think we have one, last time I checked at least. Davin chuckled before leading us outside. This way please. As Sandor, Tyrion and my undead zombie followed me, I continued to interact with Davin. The young man was blunt and outspoken, but also very jovial. Making small talk as if we were long-term friends. And, if my memory wasn't betraying me, he was also actually competent enough in combat. While he presented to me most of the noteworthy places around Lannisport that I hadn't properly spotted during my arrival, we shared a few stories of our backgrounds. Davin already knew I've come to become Lord Tywin's ward, but was actually surprised to hear that I've personally requested for that to be the case. With all due respect, why didn't you choose the kingdom your own father hailed from? He was intrigued. Because I've got just as much appreciation for my mother's kingdom of origin. Since Davin was a lion of pride instead of pragmatism, I opted for telling him about my respect for the Westerland culture while making subtle references of recruiting a small group of warriors to serve under my name, as well as pointing out that I've begun my martial training since my 4th name day. The legendary Barristan of the Kingsguard had taught you how to fight. Davin almost shouted in shock. That's really unbelievable, not that I'm doubting you. Don't worry, sometimes, even I don't believe in the amount of luck I've had. I told him with a friendly smile. Care to show me if luck was all that was involved with it? Davin asked, clearly challenging someone less than half his age for a spar. Before Sandor could grunt an attempt to intimidate the young man, I preemptively raised my hand to stop him while Tyrion remained too amused to say anything. I meant no disrespect, of course. Davin apologized, recalling that my height and size hid really well my age. Don't worry, there's no harm with a friendly spar from time to time. Besides, training with only one partner embeds my errors and makes me unfit to adapt. I replied to the young noble of Lannisport. I've been meaning to ask how capable you were in combat. Guess I will be getting my answer firsthand. You certainly will, dear nephew. Tyrion chuckled, surprised to not be busy thinking about whores and wine since his arrival. Just when I was thinking you and I were so much alike, you had to act like your Uncle Jaime would. Sandor remained silent, still not comfortable speaking his mind, though for some reason he became curious about the silent winner of both archery and melee that has remained just as silent as him. Had to keep the undead around in order to keep it in check from time to time, otherwise risk its disguise to be somehow compromised. My zombie knight was not as tall as the hound, but I would wager that he could match, if not surpass, Sandor's strength since his monster stats didn't translate equally to regular people. Interestingly enough, the two of them had in common a weakness to fire. It's not like I was required to be shielded by these two to fend for myself, being capable of killing them before they could even react, but it helped sell the illusion of me being a mere talented and smart young prince who still required plenty of time to begin playing the Game of Thrones. Having gotten a better understanding of the city's layout from our brief tour, I requested that we return to his family's residence and begin that sparring we've decided previously. And so he complied. To the surprise of none, I was capable of matching Davin's skill with a dulled weapon, as I respected the recommendation of the master-at-arms of his house. Limiting myself to simply evading his strikes, while eventually delivering some casual parries followed by precise ripostes. Who would have guessed, after several battles in underground dungeons against hordes of undeads, sparring with someone 10 years older than me would be considered as a social interaction. Make no mistake, I could still be killed by regular foes, it would just take a little longer with my health bar being twice as large as when I began killing criminals during my night raids. Not to mention skills like health regeneration and damage resistance, or the armor I had bought from my Nexus, market alongside my abjuration spells. Proof that I wasn't neglecting my safety was that I had finally taken the time to practice with a proper shield. Sure, it was the iconic buckler shield since my size currently didn't favor larger ones, but I was just beginning to grind that skill. Back to the sparring match on the training yard. I didn't want to freak Davin out, so I kept leveraging my mobility anticipating his moves in order to dominate the duel without raging or action surging. It was in moments like these that my passive skills and rogues features shined the most. Props to Davin for actually taking me seriously as an opponent from start to finish instead of pretending to be going easy on me because of my age and royal title. You seem a little tired. I teased him while dodging one of his best strikes before circling around him and touching his nape with the tip of my blunt sword. And dead, even if you had armor. Davin chuckled and raised his arms in defeat. My prince, I surrender. Well done, nephew. Tyrion congratulated me with a supportive smile while Sandor had an expression of surprise. The Bravasi clearly wasn't lying about what a great apprentice you've been to his teachings. Thanks, uncle, I replied before turning to my opponent. Don't worry too much about it. Seldomly will you find an agile opponent with a small frame like mine. Take solace that since I wasn't allowed to practice beyond this, I've made sure to master the basics. You speak the truth, Davin acknowledged, removing his training gear before clearing the sweat out of his forehead. Though in all honesty, I was planning to hold back so as not to hurt you, but you forced me to get serious from the start as you kept avoiding all of my attacks and finding openings in my guard. Noticing his self-doubts, I persuaded him. Keep your head high. You are a pretty skilled fighter. If I wasn't focusing on avoiding your strikes, you might have gotten me before I got you to tire yourself out. But let's not fool ourselves, the situation would have been much different if I wasn't royalty. I'm thankful for your words. Davin nodded truthfully with a genuine smile. As he noticed his sisters staring at us from a nearby window, he waved at them with a teasing expression. I've noticed them stalking us since we've returned from our tour around the port city, but as I move to look at them, the two run away. Are you all right? I asked Davin, faking ignorance. Yeah, just my sisters. He told me before heading somewhere else. Serena and Myriel. Normally, teenage girls wouldn't be blushing over some kid under any circumstance, regardless if he appeared to be a few years older. But being born as the crown prince has granted me a boost in relationship with basically every girl that valued social status. Which would have been a major problem if I actually cared about genuine love. The brief peek I had at Davin's sisters allowed me to observe them. Honestly, I was not at all surprised that my mother had sent them a letter explaining that if one of them were to grow close to me, she would give her full support for a future match. Honestly, I'm surprised Cersei never attempted to pull such things during canon with Joffrey, especially since she much rather he didn't marry Marjorie. Sure, Robert desired to have his house bound by blood with the Starks, but regardless of how much I managed to impress him, my Valyrian features were still too much for him to handle. So I wasn't expecting him to arrange a marriage between me and Sansa. Stupid I know, but it's the demon of the trident we are talking about. Having him completely ignore Rhaenys' existence was all but a miracle to me. Though from the gossip I got from skulking around on Varys territory, I heard that Elise was the candidate all the servants were betting on. Even Jon Arryn wasn't as subtle as he believed himself to be. In any case, I'll still be spending plenty of time in the Westerlands, so I was in no hurry to rush those kinds of things. For now, establishing a friendship bond with Serena and Myriel's brother in order to make him a follower would suffice for now. Arriving back at Castle Rock after spending the day roaming Lannisport and bonding with Davin, I met with Tywin to inform him of what I needed him to do for me. Tyrion followed me until we reached his father's solar, as Sandor and my disguised zombie knight stood guard on the door. I noticed the unhealthy relationship between the Lannisters while the dwarf informed me he had something to do, almost running away from his father's gaze. Tywin clearly didn't seem to care much about his son's fear of him, but I did. You will stop that, I commanded him as soon as the doors were closed. The old lion raised an eyebrow in confusion, but before he could ask anything, I interrupted him. This petty vendetta and childish antagonism towards Tyrion, I remarked. For a man so consumed by the idea of his family, you clearly have no idea how to keep them united. You were lucky that Kevin has proven himself loyal and competent enough to fully support you despite you never acknowledging his efforts. But Tyget and Garyon, I would give them less than a couple of years before they are either dead or leaving Westeros to never come back. You know Noth, did you have more visions? Tywin stopped mid-answer before questioning me, immediately remembering that I had claimed to have foreseen the approaching rebellion of House Greyjoy. As a matter of fact, I did, several of them. I told him a half-truth. Not that I needed a glimpse into the future to tell how unstable your actual family really is. The old Lannister remained silent, having grown used to not imposing or demanding things from me. After telling him slightly altered versions of Tyget and Garyon's fates, I returned to the topic of Tyrion. If you continue to mistreat Uncle Tyrion like that, he will either make a move against you or be explored as a weakness by any other rivaling house. You expect me to simply forget and forgive everything he has done to my family? Tywin argued back, holding back his tongue just enough to not outright insult me. Like what? Being born, I retorted. I believe you are intelligent enough to recognize that stillborns and miscarriages aren't that much of a rare occurrence. Half of those cases pretty much result in the death of the mother as well. Even so, he tried to argue, but I stopped him by summoning Shadow over his desk. Her intense gaze seemed to perfectly translate my warning. What's the matter then? Do you feel too ashamed that he's a dwarf? Does it seem he had a choice on it? I remarked. Do you believe your wife would be happy with the way you've been treating the son she had given her life for? I allowed him this time to speak, wanting to have him reflect on my words while also telling me what was stopping him from behaving like an actual father. And what has he done with that life she had sacrificed? Tywin finally showed signs of anger. Wasting his time laughing, whoring and marrying peasants. Interesting you brought those topics up. You do remember I know more than I have any right to, don't you? I smirked at him. I know about the incident where you all but have ordered the rape of your daughter-in-law. I know about a hidden tunnel leading to a brothel built by a certain hand of the king on King's Landing. And I know about your differences with your own father. I made a small pause to let the information I just gave him sink in, and by his shocked expression it seems have hit the bullseye on each answer. My plan was to make it so obvious that he and Tyrion had so much in common, that any suspicion of him being a bastard son of Aerys, which my system confirmed to me he wasn't, would simply be dismissed as too improbable. Look, I'm not expecting you to become the most considerate and caring father all of a sudden. I've already told you that I will release Jaime from his Kingsguard vows, so you won't have to worry about Tyrion claiming Castle Rock as rightfully his. Just make up your mind. I finally said, with a cold stare. Send him to the Citadel and have him study to become a maester or immediately start to shape him to become the man he was always meant to be. And with luck, he might serve Jaime just as well as Kevin is serving you. As the old lion remained silent, overwhelmed by his thoughts, I called Shadow back and made a move to leave earlier than I had planned. deciding it was better to give him all the time to properly digest everything I had just dropped on top of him. If you are simply not capable of making this sacrifice for your own family and nourishing such a valuable asset, just get rid of him and make it appear to be an accident, I said, placing a hand on the doors. Or better yet, hand him to me. Leaving the chamber, I wasn't sure if Tywin would swallow his pride and make the right choice, but either way, I would have one less thing to worry about. Though I've got to stop having these sort of intense meetings with him. Watching him obediently hear what I gotta say is slowly chipping away the image I had of him in my head. That wasn't good. My respect was basically the only thing preventing me from having him punished for his crimes instead of going out of my way to have him on my side. But that's a problem for another time. As Sandor and my zombie knight followed me in silence, I met the Lannisters I've been looking for. You want me to do what? Tygett questioned my previous invitation to aid me with building my royal legion. You heard me, Granduncle Tygett. I've been meaning to recruit a small group of capable men that would serve as my personal guard. Perhaps one day, if the idea is successful enough, I might turn it into the royal army. Hey, gotta give the boy credit, Ty. He's ambitious and pragmatic. No wonder Tywin accepted to foster him. I mean, other than him being the crown prince and all. Garyon smiled amicably while patting on Tygett's back, to his annoyance. Besides, this might be the chance you've been so desperately seeking. While the older brother made an irked expression towards the youngest, I spoke out again. I would also appreciate your aid on this endeavor, Granduncle Garyon. Wait, me? What can I help you with? Garyon questioned. Despite his surprise, the smile never left his face. I'm not really a soldier, you see. Honestly, since wars aren't that common, fighting would be the least of my priorities for now. I remarked before turning my head to face Tygett. Though not to the point of neglecting it. Facing Garyon again, I continued. I've heard you are a pretty good sailor. Perhaps you might help me with the principles of building an effective fleet. Though you are entirely free to decline my invitation. Hey, it's a neat little trick you do. You move your lips and your grandfather's voice comes out. Garyon chuckled, though this time his smile faltered ever so slightly. Well, sure, I don't mind helping you out with this idea of yours. It's not like I have anything more important to do anyway. Excellent. As the two of us turned to face Tygett, he grunted before clearing his throat. I don't mind it either. I can get you some capable men, but they won't be of much use without proper equipment and supplies. Especially during this bloody winter. Don't worry, I've already got Uncle Tyrion to help me think about the logistics. And as for the winter, I've heard we have some massive enclosed space under the rock that's not being used at all. It's more like a cavern used to house a small army during times of war in order to garrison the rock. Tygett informed while scratching his beard. Though it hasn't been used in centuries for anything other than storage. For simple training drills, I believe it will do nicely. I replied back before turning to Garyon. As for the ship, I have already bought a simple galley during my visit to the city. Would you be so kind as to show me the way of recruiting and commanding a crew? You have but to ask. Garyon nodded with a friendly smile. Splendid. Turning to Tygett, still expecting his answer, I got his response. I accept. The prideful Lannister knight relented. Letter to all citizens of the Seven Kingdoms and beyond. I shall see to the establishment of a private legion of soldiers. This legion will not be founded on any bias. Rivalries and prejudices of all types will be set aside for the well-being of Westeros. Its units will fight alongside each other to rid Westeros of its afflictions. This company will be known as the Royal Legion. Whether you are from the North, the Vale, the Iron Islands, the Stormlands, Dorne, the Westerlands, the Reach, the Crownlands, or the Riverlands, you have the option to join the Legion. It will be akin to the Night's Watch in that respect. But whereas the Night's Watch guards the realms of men, this army shall protect those realms more directly. Furthermore, any person who joins the Legion will not be expected to serve for life, only as long as they wish to. Any person who desires to join the Legion needs only to approach its main base and enlist. It matters not whether you are highborn or lowborn, whether you are a bastard or legitimate, whether you are green or hardened. So long as you can prove your usefulness somehow, you are welcome here. Anyone who has committed a crime or intends to, do not think of the Legion as an alternative to taking the black. The whole purpose of its existence is to hunt down and capture people like you. Unless you have been pardoned by the king or the individual you have wronged, no criminals will be granted quarter or entry. For the ambitious ones who require more of an incentive, there is more to be gained in the Legion than the fulfillment of one's sense of duty. Those of you in pursuit of money have the ability to become rich. Those of you who desire glory have the option to become famous. Those of you who yearn for adventure have the chance to become great. Whatever your case, once you join the Legion, your first and only true responsibility is to serve the realm. So I appeal to your love for your homeland and your obligation to do what is right. Fight together so that future generations will be spared further conflict. Will that be enough, my prince? Asked Tywin, a little unsure of the path I was about to take. I am, was my final answer. None of that was thought up on the spot. Not wanting to make any revisions, I had decided what I was going to say to everyone in Westeros well in advance. All the same, it took Tyrion over 5 minutes to write that letter. Once the little Lannister was finished, I took up the letter and examined it, trying to imagine how it would appear to the lords, knights and smallfolk of the Seven Kingdoms. It was meant as a summon, albeit an optional one. I could actually see myself answering this summon of my own free will hadn't I been born as the crown prince. Given how many houses there were in the Seven Kingdoms, it would take days to compose a letter to all of them. So I had Tywin order every one of his retainers who could write to assist us. The process went by much faster. By midday, all the 500 letters had been written. And immediately after, the ravens were dispatched to begin sending them. There was nothing more to do at that point but wait for all of the letters to be delivered and the responses to come up. Explaining once again to both Tygot and Garyon my plans for the military group I wanted to be raised as mine, I started explaining that to me there were two main types of soldiers. My full-fledged legionnaires will be Westerosi citizens, while the auxiliaries will be mostly composed of foreign sellswords and the like. Though each type will still be supplied with their own equipment after swearing an oath of loyalty to me. A formality for now, but still a necessary one, and an excellent excuse to punish treason accordingly. My legionnaires will be arranged in an infantry unit as part of a group of 8 men, a contubernium, who all will share sleeping quarters. And since I was going with the theme of the 7, I would frame it as a rotational leader commanding 7 men. New soldiers with less combat training would be stuck with dirty jobs like stone breaking, furnace stoking and latrine cleaning until they secure a specialist post like surveyor, trumpeter, mason, clerk and huntsman or join the regular troops. 10 contubernium together formed a century, 80 men each, with its own standard bearer, commander of the watch, second in command and a centurion to lead them all. 6 centuries together make up a cohort, 480 men each, and 10 cohorts plus a small cavalry unit, of around 120 riders, which wouldn't be composed of actual knights yet, made up the biggest army unit of them all, the Legion. Which would be less than a fifth of what the Westerlands was capable of mustering, 55,000 men, whenever Tywin called his banners. Each cohort in a legion would be numbered from 1 to 10, technically 7 if I come up with another clever yet simple excuse. Cohort 1 will be extra large, with 5 double centuries, 800 instead of 480. Its centurions will be the senior ranking, first orders, and the most senior of all will be first lancer. The first lancers could be promoted to become camp prefect, in charge of the daily running of the legion. Outranking them, will be 7 men, preferably all tremendously skilled knights, while 2 of them would be the candidate to become a senator, member of my governing and advisory council of generals, and the commander of the entire legion. Overall, the commander of the legion will command 6,000 troops, which might seem ludicrously high, but is in actuality very low compared to what each kingdom was capable of mustering. 15,000 for the crown lands. 35,000 40,000 for the north. 35,000 40,000 for the riverlands. 35,000 40,000 for the Vale. 50,000 55,000 for the Westerlands. 15,000 for the Iron Islands. 20,000 25,000 for the Stormlands. 20,000 30,000 for Dorne. And 120,000 for the Reach. This totals around 380,000 troops. Given unknown variables, like Dorne's unknown true strength and the extra potential forces available on Skagos or sellswords, this could be raised for 400,000 for the entirety of the 7 kingdoms. And that's only speaking about the military. The overall population would be somewhat like this. 1.5 million for the Crown Lands. 4 million for the North. 4 million for the Riverlands. 4 million for the Vale. 5.5 million for the Westerlands. 1.5 million for the Iron Islands. 2.5 million for the Stormlands. 3 million for Dorne. And 12 million for the Reach. If the population of the Reach seems disproportionately huge, it's worth remembering that in 1300, the population of France was approximately 17 million compared to 3 million for England. Which makes it kind of incredible that England was able to maintain any possession at all on the continent given the overwhelming French numerical superiority. Obviously, this whole quality over quantity matter will only work if I make sure that my royal army only accepts the best of the best while not wasting time or resources on the mediocre ones. Alongside a thorough understanding of tactics and strategy. My army main symbol will be the banner of a black lion on a stormy field with well-worked ornaments of silver and gold that would symbolize both the new and old gods. Though in the future, as the number of men serving me would continue to grow, I plan to have one specific for each kingdom's legion. Still working on them, but preferably it would not be limited to the symbols from each of the great houses of Westeros. And yes, I was considering having at least a standing legion armed with the best from each kingdom. Mostly to not compromise the overall structure of my army if a few of the kingdoms rebelled. Sure, it would be a bitch to face a few disbanded segments of my own creation on a battlefield, but I would take those odds instead of having the entirety of my war machine broken into chaos. To prepare for the worst-case scenario, I've considered that a soldier who has dutifully served my royal army for 30 years and survived, should receive appropriate rewards, like a small plot of land for him and his heirs, as well as a pension while he remains alive. Nothing larger than the salary of what they would receive during their time as an active soldier, but much more than a veteran old man could hope to get anywhere else. These rewards would ensure some semblance of loyalty, while also motivating others to seek acceptance into my forces. Or to not throw their lives away with stupidity disguised as pointless bravery. I don't want all the work put into raising legendary elite soldiers to be wasted like that. I want them to curse and fight until their hearts are done pumping. And even after that, depending on how well I manage to master the secrets of necromancy. Because my soldiers will not buckle or yield when faced with the cruelty of this world. My soldiers will push forward. My soldiers will scream out. My soldiers will action surge and rage. But enough rambling about the future. I not only had the band of men that followed me to Castle Rock, but also some of the Lannisters to help me achieve my goals for this project. With luck, by the time the Greyjoys openly revolt, I will have a very well-trained legion ready to gain actual experience in war. Since I had yet to come up with a proper idea for an effective naval warfare system and had only a single galley that I could truly call mine, I relied on others to make do for me. During times of peace, trade had the advantage of being a less risky investment than it would be amidst war, but the availability of competition made it just as challenging to achieve revenue and profit. Yet, because money was not a problem to me, even more than others could imagine, I could simply kill two birds with one stone. By using it as a way of acquiring new skills and experience while also explaining a little of where the money I'll be spending has come from. Sure, I was crown prince and most wouldn't dare to question me about it, but both my parents and the members of the small council, like Varys and Baelish, could find it weird that I've been making use of a seemingly infinite amount of money without a justifiable origin. That was another reason for why I chose to become Tywin's ward and reveal to him my secrets. He knows that I have a massive fortune at my disposal and understands that I will require a valid excuse to not draw too much attention. The old lion could be more actively trying to outsmart me, but I wasn't planning on giving him breathing space. When we first met, I hit him with startling revelations. Now, I have him working non-stop in order to prepare for the Greyjoy rebellion. But once again, I digress. The galley I had requested Garyon to aid me with, which had yet to receive a proper name and crew, will be busy circling around Westeros shores trading goods and even acting like some sort of floating pawnshop. Getting loans in exchange for collateral, which could be anything of value traded for cash. Though the Crownlands were one of the smallest territories in the kingdom, my birthplace, the capital city, King's Landing, was the largest port city and trade hub in the continent, with merchants and traders from all over the world gathering to buy and sell. This way I had a more secure way of receiving and sending anything with Tobo, Halline and Chataya, be it letters or actual new inventions. The Crownlands therefore had great wealth. And a great variety of artisans and skilled laborers, despite how outside the capital, the towns and villages of the realm were more agriculturally dependent. Although I wasn't ready to sell the dragonbone I brought with me from the Red Keep, I'm sure Uncle Stannis would be willing to trade his reserves of dragonglass for supplies I will be sending him. Especially since he found it to be worthless, not to mention how harsh winters were to the island father gave him to rule. Located at the center of the continent, the Riverlands had also become a profitable trade hub for the realms of Westeros. In times of peace, the many rivers and waterways of the territory were used to transport goods between the many neighboring realms, which would certainly help reduce time to reach the narrow sea. And through my proximity to the Freys, I will have some way of influencing the constructions of new bridges as well. The Riverlands themselves were able to produce a fair amount of grain from their fertile fields and were also known to produce wine. As the port city of Saltpans often traded with the free cities, though it was one of the least populous ports in the continent. I know I've already mentioned countless times, but the richest realm of the Seven Kingdoms was without doubt the Westerlands. Though their lands were quite fertile, producing many crops, they were nowhere near as lush as the Reach or the Vale. It is therefore from the mines of the Westerlands spread throughout their many hills that the realm finds its true wealth. Gold and silver mines abound in the territory, with gold mines found at the Golden Tooth, Castle Rock, Castamere, Nuns Deep and The Pendrick Hills. Lannisport and Fair Isle also engaged heavily in sea trade and fisheries, with Lannisport as one of the most active and prosperous harbors in the continent. Now, on to the kingdoms of yet to visit. The Iron Islands, small rocky lands, devoid of fertile fields and pastures, have largely based their economies around fisheries and sea trade, as well as trading iron ore, which was found in abundance in the mines beneath the islands. Aside from iron, they also produced tin and lead, yet the work was dangerous and difficult, often left to the lowest levels of society. Due to that, most have turned to raiding to make up for their lack of resources. Historians claim it was a lack of timber that originally drove the Ironborn from their homes to pillage their neighbors and plunder their goods. The Ironborn found this way of life so profitable that they centered all their culture and traditions around raiding. With their leaders, House Greyjoy, even taking the words, "We do not sow," and preference for the iron price over the golden one as a testament to their raiding ways. Out of everyone, House Harlaw and House Goodbrother were less attached to the old way. I would really appreciate getting my hands on the blueprints of their longships and some detailed understanding of how they built them so quickly with so little resources. A stark contrast from the Isles of the Ironborn, the Reach was the most fertile territory of Westeros, growing many of the finest fruits and grains in the continent. They were known for their cultivation of melons, fireplums, peaches, apples, grapes and pumpkins. And were also known for making dry fruity red wines, sweet wines and rich golden vintages such as Arbor Gold. Home to the market towns of Ashford and Tumbleton, which did a great deal of inland trading as well, without mentioning Old Town, a large port city home of House Hightower and the Maesters of the Citadel, known as the oldest city in Westeros. For this reason, the Tyrell of Highgarden have made their words, "growing strong," to symbolize their territory's wealth of resources. Suggesting that while others concerned themselves with war, the Reach was concerned with the prosperity of their people. I'm sure they will be very intrigued once the lands on the Westerlands begin rivaling their productivity, but since their massive population also required a massive quantity of food, they will have no choice other than to strike a deal. Now, onto my father's kingdom. Being one of the poorer realms of Westeros, the Stormlands, with their constant rains and storms, had relatively fertile fields, but their strong martial traditions have allowed for no major cities to develop. Instead, storm lords build great fortresses such as Storm's End and supply these forts with the labor and harvests of surrounding villages. Which was almost its downfall when Stannis almost died of hunger while facing siege during Robert's rebellion. Though the seas along the territory, especially around Shipbreakers Bay, were difficult to navigate thanks to their storms, the port city of Weeping Town was able to prosper greatly through the Sea of Dorne, trading with many of the free cities. This led me to the biggest reservatory of sand on the continent. One of the richer territories in the continent, Dorne was home to a number of exotic and highly prized goods sought after by many in Westeros and the free cities. They were known for their production of lemons, olives, pomegranates and wine, producing strong wine and Dornish sour reds. The southern lands were also known for their breeding of specialized horses, called sand steeds, who were swift and little. And it was said that they could run for nearly 2 days straight without tiring. Not the best material for warhorses, but excellent for scouts and couriers. The port city of Planky Town had done very well serving as a trade hub for Volantis and many of the other free cities, even seeing trade from the Summer Isles and Far East, providing a passage into Westerosi markets. The territory of the Vale at first glance did not seem like a rich and profitable territory with its vast mountainous ranges and dangerous roving mountain clans, yet upon closer examination the Vale was one of the most fertile territories in Westeros. Possibly even matching the fertility of most territories in the Reach. It was said wheat, corn, barley, pumpkins and other fruit grew in the Vale in great quantities and of top quality. House Waxley of Wickenden was even known to produce exotic scented candles, sometimes scented with nutmeg and other expensive spices. The port city of Gulltown had grown rich from its strategic location as a trade harbor between the North, Bravos, the Vale and King's Landing. And with this great wealth it was no wonder the Vale lords of years past were able to construct the great fortress of the Eyrie, though the houses of the Vale and small folk benefited greatly from their resources and wealth. The mountain clans described as descendants from the first men who refused to bow to Andal kings suffered greatly refusing to participate in the local economy and thereby surviving off petty theft and raiding. To me they served only as a way to earn the respect from the lords of the Vale by having my army one day get rid of them. Though the North was home to great warriors and honorable lords, it was undoubtedly one of the poorest territories of Westeros with the snows and cold weather making agricultural production quite difficult. Yet, they were not completely without resources. The North was a great provider of timber to the realms of Westeros and beyond, even producing ironwood, famed for its strength and durability. Which was a better alternative than incentivizing the cut down of weirwood trees to supply my troops and risking losing my title as a druid. The houses of the north were also known as producers of wool as well as furs and hides. And the port city of White Harbor was said to sit atop a great number of silver mines. As a result, the city itself was home to master silversmiths whose work was famed throughout Westeros. Because of the great wealth of White Harbor, House Manderley has become one of the richest families of the north, possibly second only to the Starks. Perhaps the only Andal house to prosper in the north would be another interesting partner for my cause. And it would also help that it wasn't that far away from the Dreadfort. If Joffrey was capable of convincing an assassin to attack Bran Stark inside Winterfell, I believe I could get someone to get rid of a bastard for me. Regardless, the lack of roads and vast distances between towns made inland trade difficult, meaning the small folk of these lands often lived in extreme poverty. Which was a considerable untapped demand waiting to be satisfied by my growing supplies. Only sad thing was that I couldn't simply sail around Westeros and sneak into each of the great houses' castles for their dungeons. I mean, of course I could, but without Harrenhal being officially mine, it wasn't that much of a priority. As I lived through my 6th winter, watching the slow and steady phase of recruitment and training of my forces, I got very impressed by how much was actually achieved. I wasn't worried about their skills, that could be easily raised through my teach skill, but stats were a different matter. Differently from those I added to my party, Rhaenys and Alyssa, regular people not only had a much slower pace of growth, but their stats weren't vulnerable to decreasing without diligent training. Soon enough, after spending massive amounts of gold, my forces had gotten larger in that brief time of cold and harsh weather. My Royal Legion was up to 200 recruits. A handful of people from the Westerlands, the Riverlands, Vale and the Stormlands had enlisted. Thanks to my heritage and the notable figures I had managed to get to serve me. Thoros of Myr had yet to earn his fame of being the first to breach Pike's defenses, but he knew a thing or two about medical training and how to manage the morale around the troops. Jalabar Ko was still the exiled prince, but to most he was just a random summer islander far from home. Thankfully, he was an excellent teacher of marksmanship, knowing beyond the simple uses of bows and crossbows. With luck, I could have every legionnaire trained on how to properly throw a javelin and a sling. Lothor Brune had some tips of horse riding for my scouts, and alongside Jalabar, were my best hope of getting mounted archers. Hostine and Walder were more interested with representing their families and serving Cleo's Frey, the one they viewed as the next heir to the twins, so I at least had a strong brute and a cunning strider to rely on if the occasion called. Not to mention that Jenna's son had proved himself competent enough to aid Tyrion on the work I had assigned to him. Sirio's title as the previous Sword of Bravos helped less than what I had anticipated, but he could at least teach the new recruits about the true sight that any competent water dancer ought to have. In similar fashion Bronn served me, who looked all the new recruits over, questioning them, to learn where they've fought and how well they lie. And then gave them a chance to kill him, while he did the same for them. When I asked if he had killed any, he answered, "No one we could have used." I just reminded him to be careful of not antagonizing anyone that could become a problem to us, as I personally selected the ones he had approved through my observation skill while disguised as my knight persona. It served as an excellent alternative to a background check and psychological evaluation. But the actual name that would certainly boost my legion's reputation would be Bryden Tully, well known as Blackfish. The way I see it, he was old enough to offer great advice in leading and training the men, but young enough to venture himself into action from time to time. All in all, it was no surprise that more volunteers came from the Reach than any other region by far, mostly due to their overabundance of manpower. The Crowlands and Dorne had a slightly larger turnout. Targaryen loyalists were still a problem in both places, not to mention the bad blood that resulted after my father's rebellion. So far, no one from the Iron Islands had signed up. Probably still preparing for the oncoming rebellion. As the winter came to its end, my legion had reached around 500 men and was finally ready to move out of the training camp underneath Castle Rock. The best Century's 80-men troops were sent to patrol the surrounding borders of the Westerlands while the majority of peasants received extra training to make up for their shortcomings. In time, all of them would be able to protect the realm and fulfill their thirst for adventure simultaneously. Which led me to a silly realization. Reading and hearing about Westeros was one thing. It was entirely another to see it firsthand. In the span of its 3,000+ kilometers, there were glaciers, mountains, swamps, grasslands, forests, and deserts. All those landscapes could be found in my previous world, too, of course, but not all in such a small distance. I was aware that the terrain of the Seven Kingdoms was supposed to be modeled after that of England, the terrain of the Free Cities was modeled after France and Italy, and the terrain of Slavers Bay was modeled after the Middle East. But since I don't recall having been to all of those countries in my previous life, I couldn't verify firsthand if the sizes and shapes were the only things they really had in common with Westeros and Essos. But the concept still served as a good comparison. I knew my legion would be composed of men from all the kingdoms, but I hadn't really considered the difference in strategy that each terrain would demand. Sure, I had planned to make a legion of around 5,000 men for each one of them, but the thing was that I hadn't experienced those places by myself. To me, this was even more of an incentive to clear more magical dungeons, especially the major ones. Who knows, one day the Royal Legion might even make use of fast travel once I unlocked it. Now, changing subjects. All that speaking about topography and agriculture reminded me of an important aspect of my Royal Legion. When discussing the Roman army, one almost exclusively does so from a military perspective. All too often the armchair generals concern themselves simply with strategy and tactics, where thousands of human lives were reduced to blocks on a map. To some, the soldier was nothing more than a faceless clone whose sole purpose was to do battle. This was history without the humanity aspect of it. I will throw off such myopic conventions and work on my legionnaires not only in combat, but at their dinner as well. The need to feed, as Napoleon famously said, an army marches on its stomach. This was even more true prior to the adoption of gunpowder, when men and beasts powered the weapons. In this era it was estimated that approximately 90% of the weight of the supplies required by an ancient army revolved around eating. In terms of the average Roman soldier, it was estimated that they had a recommended daily allowance of around 3,000 calories. The minimum daily requirement was far lower, as fat reserves could help provide energy when consumption was low. However, prolonged malnutrition over several days would substantially reduce a legionnaire's physical and mental abilities. A well-performing army was therefore a well-fed army. Overall, this was the way I planned to feed my Royal Legion. It broadly falls into the categories of ration and non-rational sources. Rations, whether food supplies, were issued to soldiers on a regular basis according to their rank and status. While conveniently procured for the individual, these were not entirely free, since the cost of most items was deducted from the soldier's pay. Keep in mind, for this project of mine to work, it had to reach a point of being self-sustainable, if not profitable. Evidence suggested that the rations themselves were regularized back with the real Romans. This was militarily advantageous because it allowed for the development of a highly organized and efficient logistical system. It also ensured that there was sufficient food while limiting the risks of overeating and drinking. Back during the imperial period, a soldier's rations were made up of around 75% grain and 25% non-grain of foodstuffs by weight. The latter consisted of meat, vegetables, cheese, olive oil, wine and salt. The grain ration provided the carbohydrates and calories of one's diet. It was typically distributed as wheat, though barley might also be issued as punishment or if supplies were low. The rest of the rations made sure that protein, vitamins and other vital nutrients were included. The type of meat depended on local availability, but generally consisted of pork, beef and mutton. Vegetables also varied by region. In many cases there were references to beans, lentils and peas, alongside herbs such as garlic. Cheese could be made from cow, sheep or goat's milk. It was both light and easy to transport. Olive oil was also important both as a condiment and a cooking supply. Other liquids such as wine could help provide not only nutrition but also water content. It was distributed as both vintage wine and sour wine for consumption. Lastly, salt was included to preserve food, season dishes and serve medical purposes. It was considered one of the absolute necessities when provisioning an army. While rations provided a baseline for nutrition, the army also relied on other sources to meet its daily needs. These needs ranged from absolute necessities to luxuries. On campaign, the original legion obtained these supplies using three means of collection: foraging, requisition and pillaging. Foraging involved sending out soldiers to retrieve specific items. Of utmost importance would be sending aquitires to nearby springs, rivers, lakes and wells, from which they would return to camp with full leather bags, water skins, barrels or vessels of water. Lignitors were sent to gather firewood for cooking, heating and lighting, while pabulators collected fodder for the animals. These activities were daily tasks and took many foraging parties. The expeditions of the frumentators, on the other hand, were carried out infrequently. They ventured out in large numbers to collect a wide range of foodstuffs, such as wheat, barley, olive oil, wine and fruit. Roman soldiers were eventually tasked with reaping grain in the fields or picking things from orchards. Requisition involved obtaining supplies from ostensibly friendly forces. These goods were generally brought into the army through seizure, forced purchase or private markets. A commander might issue orders for inhabitants to supply an army passing through the region. This was often done on a large scale, with villages and towns being given specific locations for deposits. Compensation could range from nothing to near market value. More often than not, such requisition was a heavy burden on the local population. By contrast, special merchants, known as sutlers, were far more eager to address the army's needs. In fact, they traveled with the legions and made a living selling them goods. It was through these sutlers that soldiers would get their gourmet items. Garam fish sauce, honey and spices were always in high demand to improve the taste of rations. While items such as fruit, eggs and fish were great additions to break up the monotony of military rations. So it comes without saying that I also planned on having a close equivalent to these sutlers spread around the realm. Finally, pillaging involved the seizing of supplies alongside the destruction of property. Such acts typically took place after a battle or siege, but might be ordered across enemy territory to punish them or goad them into battle. The Roman military strictly controlled these activities in order to impose discipline and better control the gathering and storage of provisions. In times of lack, discipline or civil war, however, an organized force might quickly become a roving band of robbers. Which I will not tolerate. It was said that once a thing got lost under a legionnaire's cloak, there was no power on earth that could snatch it away. Honestly, I've heard similar things about the gold cloaks at King's Landing. But once supplies were collected, they should be distributed to the soldiers. Some evidence suggested that rations were received on the first of the month, while non-rations were obtained on a more irregular schedule, based on demand and availability. In contrast with modern armies, which rely on central facilities, the legions at war generally prepared food at the squad level of the contubernium, the 8-man group that shared a tent. I intended to explain that for Westerosi people by mentioning that 7 men would follow a minor leader elected by them. They do, after all, love having the number 7 everywhere. 7 gods, 7 gates, 7 kingdoms not counting the other 3, and 7 kingsguards. As for the grain, which made up the majority of the soldiers' caloric intake, it could be eaten in 2 basic ways. The first was known as pools and was easier to prepare. It was made by taking wheat and adding water, salt, fat and oil or milk. For extra flavor, spices, vegetables or fresh meat could be thrown into a brass pot alongside it, and boiled to resemble modern polenta. However, this method of preparation was less common, as it would be difficult to store and transport. Generally, soldiers ate their grain in the form of bread. This took several steps. First, the grain had to be thrashed, to remove the inedible husks. Threshing occurred prior to being sent to the legions in order to reduce its total weight. If troops collected their own grain in the fields, it would be brought back into camp to be thrashed within the security of the fortifications. Next, the grain would be ground into flour, using a stone hand mill carried by each contubernium's pack animal. Milling could be repeated several times to improve the quality of the flour. The coarser flour produces a black bread consumed by the rank and file, while the more refined flour produces a white bread for the officers. Next, extra ingredients were mixed into the flour, such as salt, lard, leaven and most importantly water. Finally, the mixture had to be kneaded and baked in a campfire or hearth. For a contubernium it would take about an hour to mill their daily grain rations into flour, and another 1 to 2 hours to make the bread. To save time, several days' worth of material was often prepared at once. According to military regulations, meats of various kinds were to be baked in a campfire or boiled in a cooking pot. Alongside them would be prepared fruits and vegetables, which might be roasted on a spit or eaten raw. Evidence suggested that cheese was also manufactured by the troops. Olive oil and wine on the other hand were obtained pre-made, though soldiers might still choose to alter them prior to consumption. Sour wine for instance would be watered down into posca, a popular drink among the lower classes. Along the way, soldiers would introduce special ingredients acquired from the sutlers or collected in the field to improve their meals. However, preparing gourmet dishes was considered unsoldierly. Well-disciplined forces would in fact regulate such time-wasting activities. Exceptions of course existed for the officers and commanders, who enjoyed both better diets and more elaborate meals. In certain instances, soldiers ate pre-made meals on campaign. Or the ancient version of fast food. This was often done for strategic reasons, when the army had to move quickly. A commander might order local populations to place a prepared food along the road, as was done by Claudius and Nero on his march to repulse enemy forces in 207 BC. Alternatively, the soldiers themselves might be ordered to prepare their own meals ahead of time. This generally involved making longer-lasting foods, such as a jerky and biscuits, by removing water content. The meats would be dried and salted while the bread would be rebaked into hard tack. It should also be noted that when legions remained in place for long periods of time, their food preparation became more centralized. In these conditions, soldiers could more readily access pre-made meals from camp kitchens, local taverns, and markets. The Roman army ate 2 meals a day, breakfast or prandium, in the morning or at noon, and dinner or cena in the evening. The exact timing was at the discretion of the commanders and depended on how they planned to use the army. Eating might be scheduled right before battle as a reward for strenuous activity or in the off shifts while constructing siege works. Breakfast was light and generally consisted of cold meats and cheese, which were readily available. The dinner, on the other hand, was more hearty but included many of the more time-consuming steps I have described. When the troops ate, they did so together. The soldiers took food with members of their contubernium and were expected to eat standing or sitting. Officers dined with one another and the aristocratic higher-ups would often recline, as was befitting their class. Food and drink was consumed using a legionnaire's equipment. A bronze patera served as an all-purpose cooking pot, cup and food bowl. Solids were picked up back then using fingers, since the fork was unknown to the Romans. Daggers could cut bread and meat while spoons were used to consume soups and porridge. Additional earthenware cups might also be present alongside a range of wooden utensils. Given time, the soldiers would tend to hoard additional gear. As always, it was in the interest of a disciplined force to curb such activities. In fact, the entire highly organized process of food supply preparation and consumption was a key feature of Rome's military that is all too often overlooked. Without this engine driving the legions, they would never have achieved the levels of success that made them so famous. And I will not overlook it. During campaigns, one of the general's greatest concerns was the need to feed, and this was especially true of the Roman army, which relied on robust supplies to wage highly aggressive warfare at all times a year. Allow me to give you a sense of the scales involved here. At the lowest levels would be the individual soldiers, each carrying much of their own gear, which is estimated to have weighed around 40 kilograms. Which was important to point out since they wouldn't have access to any sort of magical inventory, like me and my party members. Additionally, each contubernium of 8 soldiers had a mule or 2 and a pair of military slaves to help them carry supplies. Since unlike Rome, slavery was outlawed in Westeros, servants and the lowest rank of soldiers will have to make do. Some sort of squire equivalent for the legionnaires, I believe, would be best. But this also meant that each legion, between 4,000 and 6,000, was accompanied by around 600 to 1,000 of mules and 1,200 servants or lowest rank soldiers. The entire army's baggage train was therefore made up of thousands of pack animals and servants, as well as hundreds of wagons and even more multitudes of non-combatants. Such a large force had significant supply needs to sustain itself, risking disbandment or worse if they weren't met. Just for context, it's suggested that on a daily basis a legion required 18,000 pounds of grain, 12,000 gallons of water and 40,000 pounds of fodder for its animals. That's unquestionably a lot of food, water and supplies. Knowing their needs was one thing. But how did they get all of this? Well, I think it's best to break down the sources of supply into several different levels. The first level was going to be the supplies carried with the army, the second one was going to be supplies gathered by the army, and then the third one was going to be supplies sent to the army. The first one, at the lowest level, each soldier was expected to have some supplies on hand. This amounted to approximately 1 week worth of food to allow for some flexibility whilst on campaign. In case of desperate need, the soldiers could even boil some of the leather on their shields or shoes to eat, but that was really stretching it. Next, you'd have the army's baggage train, which had significantly more supplies. They carried a ton of goods along with herds of animals for consumption, and this overall might be enough to last a month or more. Though it should be noted that things like water and fodder were actually impractical to carry in large quantities, and that these would be in constant need of resupply. So now, moving on to the second level. As I previously mentioned, these were gathered in approximately 3 main ways: through foraging, requisition and pillaging. Foraging involved essentially living off the land, and it was done relatively routinely, especially when searching out water, fodder and firewood. The yield of such activities would depend on the season, so obviously, when the crops were ripe and they were in the field and there were lots of fruits, they would get a high yield, whereas in the winter these activities would obviously have a much lower yield. And then the amount of supplies that they could gather did very much depend on the size of their foraging expeditions and how far away they sent them. Suffice to say that these would vary over time. The other major way that one could gather supplies would be through requisition, and this would involve the purchase or seizure of goods. And in the last way would be pillaging, which involved gathering supplies alongside the destruction of property. So using these 3 general principles of how an army gathers supplies, we can imagine sort of what activities look like as it advances at a pace of around 30 kilometers a day. Yet the army could not always count on gathering all of its own supplies, and this is where this third level comes in, where the Roman army logistics systems get involved. The most important fundamental feature here is going to be the supply line, the connection between the army and a supply source. This line was going to have a couple fixed points that are going to be important to elaborate, and these are roughly broken up into different tiers and types of bases. So these are going to be the strategic base of supply, the operational base, and then the tactical base. The strategic base was the most broad and was going to be their source, although not necessarily a single point but a broad source of provisions from outside an area of operations. Generally, we would be talking about provinces which were assigned specific armies or campaigns to support, and these supplies were gathered using various financial means including forest and market purchases, contracting, taxation, and contributions from allies. That would be outside of the theater of operations across the empire, or several provinces. One would be gathering and collecting all this food. Then these would be carried over and collected at the operational base. It would be essentially the supply line's anchor, meant to supply the Roman army in its particular area of operations. Fundamentally, it linked the waterboard and supply lines coming from those strategic bases and connected them to the land-based supply lines going to the next level, which was going to be the tactical base. These operational bases were usually located at fortified ocean or river ports, though the location might be updated over the course of a campaign for strategic or tactical reasons, as for instance of an approaching army threatening it, or perhaps another port was taken control at a more advantageous location. So operational bases could, and would, move. These bases also traditionally contained infrastructure to hold enough food and equipment for the campaigning season and, in particular, included sophisticated greeneries which were key in minimizing food spoilage. If this particular infrastructure wasn't necessarily there or didn't have the maximum amount needed for the campaign, the soldiers would get involved in building these prior to launch of the campaign. Keep in mind, fighting wasn't the only thing these soldiers were expected to do. Not by a long shot. Now, the next and final level was going to be the tactical base. Essentially the other endpoint. It's the far end of the supply line, and this is where the supply collection point is closest to the Roman force. It would traditionally be a short distance behind the army or within its own marching camp. This is where they would store supplies arriving from the operational base through that supply line, and also where they gathered the supplies that the legion got locally from living off the land. So this all would be dumped into the tactical base. It might also contain some of the Roman army's slower moving elements, such as siege equipment. And as the army moved forward again, about 30 kilometers a day, this tactical base would be picked up and moved alongside the army, trailing it and advancing with or alongside it. Now in its wake, as it moves along and redeploys, they would have a series of abandoned tactical bases. These were traditionally converted into supply depots which would go on to become the backbone of the supply line. Troops were generally left behind to garrison these. Good thing I planned to become the next coming of Bran the Builder, so building small fortifications all around Westeros wasn't that far away from my initial goals. But when we think of supply lines, it's not a long line of wagons that goes continuously from one end to the other. Instead, it's gonna be smaller convoys that arrived from controlled territory and moved between these chains of depots that finally lead up to that tactical base. Which was key because it allowed men and animals to get the necessary rest and fodder that they need along the way, instead of making a single long stretch that would be very vulnerable to attack. Another important thing was that between these different key hardpoints depots, as these convoys made their way, what the Roman army would do was build up roads, bridges, and canals to improve the efficiency of these supply routes. This was why you always hear so much about roads and infrastructure in the Roman world, because a lot of the time these were built up for military purposes to make these supply lines going to the army that was more efficient and strong. Not only just the Roman soldiers moving, but also their equipment and supplies coming up after them. I wonder if I could make the phrase agree to replicate their castle alongside the rivers of the Riverlands or somewhere else. Perhaps one day they might succeed in matching, or even surpassing, the Long Bridge of Volantis. Now, about the economic aspect that I've been so dreadfully avoiding up until now. In medieval RPGs, we're quite used to leveling up our characters from penniless peasants draped in rags to baller knights decked in the finest regalia. Common gameplay loops involved slaying foes, completing quests, searching for treasure, and spending hard-earned cash at a merchant shop. With enough grinding you could eventually kit out yourself and your party for war. At least that's how it worked for me in principle. But how did this process work in real life for regular people? In order to better contextualize this discussion, let's first look at the sort of gear which was required for war in the first place. As one would imagine, a major part of this kit would have been weapons and armor. In addition, a soldier would have also required tools for the maintenance of these arms and a whole host of other items for basic activities like eating, drinking, sleeping, marching, and camping. All of this would obviously cost money. Suffice to say that, for most soldiers and warriors, their biggest personal expense would have been their armor. For example, a lower-cost chainmail shirt could be purchased for around 16 silver stags, which was the equivalent of a little over an entire month's wage for a soldier guarding a prominent city. A higher-quality chainmail shirt and other defensive gear would be even more expensive. Buying a cuirass with pauldrons or a shield might run you 25 silver stags, while proper lance armor would be closer to 80 silver stags. By contrast, weapons were generally less expensive than armor, but still made up a significant portion of a soldier's expenses. For example, lances and swords could be bought for around 2 silver stags, or about 4 days' wages for a high-stand soldier. People who could not afford high-quality gear would have turned to cheaper alternatives. For example, rather than sporting full suits of metal armor, a poor man would usually have worn a helmet padded or quilted textile garments and carried a shield. Offensively, they would have turned to lower-tier maces or spears, which were overall much cheaper to produce since they required less metal and blacksmith work. This sort of kit was often mandated by the governing authority in many regions. Weapons and armors had gradually become better and cheaper over the course of the centuries, as blacksmiths became more common. But it was still considerably high for the average guy. Around the bigger cities, a common foot soldier could actually much more readily afford a weapon, and entire armies would have been outfitted in munitions-grade armor, which was cheaper adjustable gear made for outfitting large numbers of pikemen. But weapons and armor were not one-time purchases, they required frequent upkeep. Thus, a soldier's gear would often include items for the maintenance of these arms. This might mean something as simple as a whetstone or spare parts. More often though, attendants, servants and specialized artisans like armorers accompanied an army to properly maintain war gear that might need repair or replacement in the field. Besides weapons and armor, equipment such as clothing, tents, food, drink, alcohol, ammunition and fodder for horses was vital to maintain military forces. Individually, these purchases might be relatively cheap, but would accrue over time to the point that they might even surpass the cost of outfitting a soldier. Logistics for even small units of warriors involve significant baggage. Mounted forces in particular required huge amounts of supply for horse and rider. After all, these troops brought multiple remounts on campaign, with the more expensive steeds being reserved for actual combat. Even non-mounted forces, like archers, might have a horse to get to and from combat. An entire wagon was required for every 10 horsemen in the army, and that these wagons were pulled by their own beasts of burden, which in turn would require water and fodder. The cheapest horse might cost about 21 silver stags or around 40 days' worth of a soldier's entire wage, while a fine riding horse might cost 10 times that amount and a war horse even more. Factor all this together and you start to get a sense of how expensive warfare could be on an individual basis, let alone on a grand scale for those attempting to build their own troops. With this in mind, let's now talk about how soldiers might acquire their gear. One of the main ways for individuals to get weapons and armor was through inheritance. This was extremely common amongst the nobility, and the practice even extended into non-aristocratic families. Inheriting gear might be a huge ceremony whereby powerful named artifacts like Valyrian steel weapons were handed down over the generations. However, we see this process being much more mundane, with inheritance being spelled out in the clauses of rather boring legal documents and wills. After all, while weapons and armor were valuable and often highly decorated, they were also seen as practical tools, with most having a finite lifespan. It was expected that they would be worn out or even broken in battle, requiring constant upkeep even when left in storage. Armories, for instance, would routinely hire craftsmen to evaluate and repair their stockpiles after a campaign or battle. That being said, there were some particular cases of inheritance which were closer to what gets depicted in fantasy media. Royal armories and heirlooms often housed objects of legendary status which could be handed down from lord to lord. These prized possessions might have names, but we should remember that these sorts of occurrences were much less common. Thus, for most warriors, inheriting weapons was less like the passing down of artifacts as seen in Valyrian steel weapons and more like receiving a trusty hunting bow or spear from an elderly relative. Gear might also be handed to a warrior from outside the family, as might be the case with gifts from allies or loans from armories. Gifts of war gear, for example, sometimes accompanied the signing of a treaty or the celebration of a political marriage. Most of the time, these gifts were exchanged between powerful figures and the retainers. After all, it was in the interest of monarchs and aristocrats to ensure that their personal forces were equipped with proper weapons, armor and even horses. For the most part, these were not uniform in nature, but at least met a common level of quality. By Westerland's standards, however, aristocrats were increasingly dressing their soldiers with preset libraries. For example, elite soldiers recruited in Lannisport were given coats that were half tinted red and half plated with gold. The procurement of gear was thus concentrated into the hands of the wealthy who bought and stockpiled large quantities of equipment ahead of major campaigns. I've heard of a merchant who collected over 4,000 chainmail shirts and 6,000 shields and mountains of other gear for a campaign expecting another Blackfire rebellion or Ironborn raid. Given such large volumes, it was now possible for buyers to source their equipment directly from manufacturing centers. However, rich individuals weren't the only ones who served as consolidators of equipment. Towns and cities also maintained armories to arm their citizens for local defense. These stockpiles contained both personal items such as weapons and armor, as well as larger assets like artillery and ammunition. The latter commonly came in the form of large torsion-powered crossbows called springald and several sets of bolts which would be key to the defense of urban settlements. But let's suppose that war was coming and you had neither inherited nor been given all the gear you needed. The next option available to you would be to purchase these items, in popular media. This usually gets depicted as a buyer traveling to a single smith in a small shop. While this certainly did happen, given how capable Tobomot was, the arms industry was much larger in scale, consisting of an enormous network of craftsmen workshops and merchants. These were available to supply anything an army could need, from personal weapons like a sword or bow, to massive orders for thousands of shields, helmets and lances. Wealthy nobles might have their own workshop set up to equip themselves and their soldiers, but would also travel directly to production centers in order to buy custom sets of gear in bulk. The cost of weapons and armor depended on what you're looking for. A used spear, for example, could be bought cheaply for less than a day's wages for a regular worker. But a basic to custom sword, harness with gilding or other forms of decoration would be much more expensive. As you can imagine, prices varied widely for each product, and one could easily spend a fortune on military gear. For example, Tobomot's armorer's workshop at King's Landing employed over 20 people and cost more than 500 golden dragons a year to operate. The craftsmen who made these equipment were valuable and well paid, especially for high-end custom production. Armorers and weapon makers contracted for royal workshop often had exclusivity clauses in their contracts and were frequently subject to royal legislation, aimed at regulating such an important market. Fraud, for example, was a constant problem which plagued the major production centers. What happened was that unscrupulous merchants would purchase cheap armor elsewhere, then bring it to a city famous for its weapons such as King's Landing, where the item would be stamped with a false maker's mark and sold for a profit. Cities and towns tried to protect themselves from such forgeries, but legislation designed to punish counterfeit sellers were difficult to enforce and did not seem to have halted the practice. This all led to vast amounts of new military gear being produced and dumped onto the market by the major players in the industry. These might be sold locally or exported to other regions around the world. Used gear also added to the number of items on the market in the form of a huge second-hand equipment industry, being propped up by smaller-scale merchants and individuals. Soldiers even served as vendors themselves, when they might sell off their gear to buy more practical things like food, drink and transportation. The battlefield itself was also another important source of war gear. Indeed, weapons and armor were commonly looted from the battlefield. In some cases, this might be completely unrestrained, free for all. For the most part, however, looting was an organized process to make sure that everyone knew that they would get a share of the spoils and would be properly motivated to keep fighting rather than breaking off to scavenge mid-battle. Generally speaking, battlefield loot was usually supposed to be divided into shares. The overall commander of the army would get a cut, followed by the captains and their soldiers. For some sellsword companies on ASOIAF, the specific ratio of what shares a captain or commanders would be entitled to would often be made explicit in a formal contract. This meant that, even if a mercenary looted a valuable weapon from a dead noble on the battlefield, they would probably not be able to keep it for themselves. Instead, the weapon would become part of the overall value of the loot from which the sellsword would receive their share. Such earnings could be quite significant, however, to the dismay of the troops, an army wouldn't always be able to loot a battlefield. For instance, maesters have described numerous mass graves from the battle of the past, where many soldiers were buried with their weapons and armor intact. This might occur for any number of reasons, but the most common was the fear of a pending attack. Specific orders about how to handle the process of looting the dead were common, commanding that soldiers should take armor only to supplement their own and to ignore any that could not be carried easily. This was a necessary decision meant to keep the army mobile in the event of another attack by rallying troops. Thus, I have elaborated on the ways regular soldiers had to equip themselves for battle. This would be easy enough to achieve for someone with a lot of money, but proved significantly harder for those at the other end of the socio-economic spectrum. However, there was a surprising amount of social mobility to be achieved through warfare. Soldiers were paid based on their level of equipment, so for example a basic spearman would receive far less than a man-at-arms in full-plated harness mounted on a war horse. If you inherited, got gifted or scavenged enough war gear though, you could theoretically move up the ranks. Perhaps even enough to impress someone through your feats and be anointed as a knight. This sudden increase in wealth and status would have translated into a literal socioeconomic class change, which had huge implications for them and their family. After all, landed knights were one step away from becoming lords themselves. The 11th of June 2021. The 11th of November 2021. The 5th of May 2022. Hope this chapter is of your liking. Anything you wish to ask, feel free to do so. Check out my auxiliary chapter if you still haven't. Thanks as always for your attention and please be safe. Any problems with my writing, just point them out and I will correct them as soon as possible. Sorry for the constant delays, I've been busy taking care of a family member while studying for my college exams. Asterisk as for the constant info dumps about the logistics of raising and maintaining a personal army, I will stop with them for a while since most of you seem to not enjoy it that much. Cold sweat smile. My intentions behind it was to make it more believable that a single boy had managed to make an army following the mold of the Roman legion. But I'm aware that my writing skills aren't that high to make it more of a pleasant reading experience. Sorry if it really bothered you. I recommend fanfiction.net, The Mountains Range, from the Passionate Admiral. It helped and inspired me a lot to create my story. I really like it. Check it out. Your gift is the motivation for my creation. Give me more motivation. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Vote for me, have some idea about my story. Comment it and let me know. I tagged this book, come and support me with a thumbs up. Like it, add to library. Daichi_TBR 193 creators thoughts. 425 comments 0 vote. The black lion grows stronger from winter and reaches the garden. Durandon's POV. So, after filling my days administrating the foundations of my forces, the first 2 months following the end of winter had finally passed. And I had to say, save for the occasional setback with logistics of raising an army of elite soldiers and breakthroughs on my titles levels that weren't worth any new feature, they were mostly uneventful. However, since I was too young to be taken seriously by the masses and noble lords, I had decided to assign both Tyget and Garion specifically to represent my will and earn some credit to their names in return. Speaking of the Laughing Lion, in the same fashion, I had Garion guide me through simple lessons of actually sailing and commanding a crew, incidentally laying the foundations of my Marines and Navy fleet. Granduncle, would you kindly inform me of everything that is worth mentioning about your progress? Grandfather has been expecting a full report of our situation. I requested Tyget, the one I've left in charge of training and commanding the soldiers of my royal legion. Yes, my prince, he replied ever so dutifully, still insisting on treating me with all the proper respect someone of my position deserved, before immediately recollecting every piece of information in a militaristic fashion. The Royal Legion was called upon often enough, but our errands up to this point have generally consisted of little more than hunting down bandits, rogue lawbreakers and the occasional band of outlaws. Tyrion joined us, alongside Davin, immediately sharing his personal understanding of the situation. Which wasn't supposed to be that common in the Westerlands, considering that my father had always been so meticulous with keeping the order in his kingdom for that to be the case. Instead of staring at my uncle with disdain, Tyget and Davin nodded silently, before the latter requested to speak. Go on. I gestured for him to continue. Davin cleared his throat before speaking with confidence. My educated guess is that the change of seasons has been slowly causing a small crisis in the realm, with the agriculture of all the continents still struggling to readjust. The crime rate in Westeros steadily rose as an indirect consequence. Even trade with Essos hasn't been as successful as my father had expected, probably because even they are having trouble with it. I see it as a sign that things will get worse before we can make a difference. Tyrion remarked to them before reminding me of something. Strangely enough, I was relieved from that realization. It implies that I would have plenty of opportunities to demonstrate my legion's aptitude. With the more opportunities I took advantage of, the greater the impact and influence we would have on Westeros. As Tyget, Davin and Tyrion continued to inform me of everything they thought I would be interested to know, I kept thinking. With Tywin Lannister being already aware of my magic, it was but a simple matter of having my inventions being effectively introduced to solve most of our current problems, while the old lion covered up for me with logical justifications from his part. Money clearly wasn't a problem for either of us, but during each harsh winter, food was actually worth more than gold. Thankfully, lands under the neck weren't buried under thick layers of snow during those periods, which allowed the soil to still be somewhat usable for agriculture. And by mixing my experimental fertilizer rich in nitrogen around the land without anyone being aware, I accomplished that all the processes of seed sprouting happened much faster, while incidentally making sure that most of the fruits would be optimal for consumption. And I was confident it would immensely help my plans for the future. Taking time to access everything that has been said to me up to that point, I was still hearing stories from things that I already had a little bit of knowledge about, so I returned to my mental rambling. Honestly, all of this preparation reminded me of playing Age of Empires while being mindful of my civilization's resources and advancements. As by the end of 289 AC and the beginning of 290 AC, my royal legion had progressed from the vanity project of the young crown prince to something more realistic. Although we hadn't fought in any wars yet, we've slowly but surely assumed the post of those responsible for keeping the order around the Westerlands. Davin spoke up again, showing his optimistic mindset. And I agreed with him. You could say that, Tyget remarked, seemingly guessing my opinion, caressing his beard while staring down at the map of the Westerlands displayed on the table among us. But I would recommend saving that judgment for later. Once we've expanded to a proper size, we will have to deal with the challenges all powerful organizations do. Betrayal and corruption. It could still work, but we will face huge risks. Fortunately, we will have help. Spoke a familiar voice with its peculiar mirthful mood. The small folk are already singing praises at our efforts. And even if most nobles aren't that mindful of us, due to our lack of numbers and battlefield experience, that certainly has its uses as well. Laying a proper foundation with useful connections, that should be our main concern. At that point the four of us were joined by Garyon Lannister himself, who immediately understood the nature of our conversation, accompanied by an actual lioness, one of the newest pets of House Lannister after my arrival. From my experience with Shadow, I got curious about interacting with the caged lions in Castle Rock during my brief stay here. These big cats haven't been trained in proper combat yet, only being taught how to behave and follow, though I doubt her nature would allow it to be that much of an issue if the need arises. Garyon, being the most unorthodox Lannister of his family, volunteered himself to test one of them out. From the looks of it, and the brief words I got from this lioness in particular, who was currently being patted by Davin, this crazy idea had some merit behind it. So far, I've actually managed to tame some lions in order to have them be to the Lannisters of Castle Rock what the direwolves were to the Starks of Winterfell. Using the excuse that a skilled animal trainer had sold them to Tywin, who was initially hesitant for obvious reasons, but soon agreed to my point of them being quite useful in both practical and intimidating purposes. Though contrary to the Starks, I wasn't going to have them travel around Westeros before I was absolutely certain that these tamed lions and lionesses wouldn't make a fool out of House Lannister. Ready for another voyage, Dawn? Garyon asked after noticing that most of the important matters had already been discussed. I've never seen anyone more at ease inside a ship. Hey, that is, anyone that wasn't an Ironborn. I recalled that great opportunity for me to gain new skills and complete more quests. During an entire week, under my request, I had the charismatic Lannister helping me with climbing masts, tying knots, scrubbing decks, pulling oars, caulking leaks, raising and lowering sails, manning the crow's nest, learning to navigate and steer. Even got Tyrion to join in the fun, especially since Tywin wasn't willing to openly oppose me. Meanwhile Tyget helped me with organizing and leading my royal legion, not to mention practical warfare lessons to compensate for my lack of study from Pycelle. Noticing how helpful Davin was being to Tyget, I confirmed that I've successfully placed Davin in an excellent position to learn everything he could from the experienced Lannister knight. Even acting as his squire whenever I wasn't in need of his presence, which would hopefully secure him a well-deserved knighthood. It had taken all my persuasion and planning skill to make all of them believe I wasn't bossing them around, much less manipulating them as my pawns, fabricating an illusionary comprehension that I've trusted everything on their own competences and personal judgments. Don't get me wrong, they weren't dim-witted or anything close to it, I just wasn't the type to completely trust others. Even Elise and Rhaenys weren't completely aware of all the contingencies I've prepared for them in case of an emergency. Shrugging my shoulders, I finally reasoned without caring too much about it. I suppose that other than the Valyrians to which I owe a little bit of Harem and I also have the river-faring people of Royne to take after. However, that notion made the Lannisters stop in realization for a moment. While I had the option to personally pick which bloodlines I wanted to be affiliated with, it was still uncommon to be so much shaped by one's own lineage, regardless if most of the great houses had existed for thousands of years and intermarriage between them not being that rare. To break the awkward silence, I tactfully answered Garyon's initial question. Though sadly I won't be repeating it again for quite a while, Granduncle. Since winter has passed, time has once again become a commodity I can't spend so freely without jeopardizing my other responsibilities with my grandfather. Oh, I see. Garion, and the others, focused on me again. I suppose it makes total sense. After all, it's Tywin we are talking about. See, Tywin was my best excuse for anything. I mentally shouted before ending our brief meeting. Dismissing them for now, I walked out of our reunion chamber, having both Sandor and my undead knight immediately following me. Occasionally I had sneaked around as my knight and bard personas, dropping some inspiration here or there towards where I wanted them to go or simply doing tasks myself, like challenging the most skilled fighters and entertaining them with my songs during their off-duty time. That reminds me, I thought while turning my gaze at my bodyguard disguised as my knight persona. My arcane studies, and in particular experiments with controlling undeads, were somewhat successful. I still kept my undead knight disguised as whatever identity I wished to have by my side at a certain moment, and that led to my understanding of necromancy shaping up to become the highest of all the other schools of magic. Subtly staring at my right palm while activating my Hand of Harm monk feature on top of my decompose spell, I watched as it became pitch black with my key manifesting necrotic energy. In general, think of magic within the school of necromancy as manipulating the ebb and flow of different creatures, life energy, or the balance of energy between life and death. This could also come across in the form of helping resurrection or draining health with necrotic damage, but also dealing with shadow magic. Don't worry, I'm well aware that necromancy could eventually prove to be a monkey's paw of sorts. But right now, it was just like any other school of magic that could be misused if not properly understood. And I took solace that the stranger itself didn't warn me against delving into the necromancy arts. Dismissing the abyssal magic pulsating on my hand, I moved on. I could feel that my grim harvest had the potential to expand beyond merely absorbing a bit of health from the targets I slew. If stamina and mana were to be included on that deal, my dream of becoming a one-man army would be one step closer. Though precaution so as not to turn myself into an inferior version of a vampire. And control undead, albeit considerably harder to sustain the longer it lasted or the more undead I had under my control, was another one of my contingencies in case my legion ever betrayed me. Considering that regular corpses were still denied to me at the moment, it was a real pity that I missed the chance of binding one of those shadows or the spellcasting undead to my will. As I made my way around the Lannister castle, somehow, I knew exactly who I was going to meet this time. Oh, there you are, young man. I heard Jenna Lannister, the middle child of the late Lord Tytos Lannister, greet me rather affectionately. Not like that, I mentally corrected it, at least not this time, with both Sandor and my undead knight close behind me. You've been looking for me, Grandaunt. Is there anything I can do for you? I respectfully asked, delicately asking her to bring me up to speed. Oh, there's plenty of, is just that wonderful girl you brought with you who keeps insisting to work as a servant despite the fact that I've reminded her she was our guest. Jenna said with a worried tone after quickly correcting herself. I tilted my head in reaction, having already taken my time to explain things to Pia, only to have her remarking how cute I was. I wouldn't worry about it, Grandaunt. I've explained to her that she wasn't expected to work like she did back with Lady Went. But she insisted that she would hate to become a nuisance. And to thank for the hospitality, she wishes to help whenever she can, and learn as much as she can as well. Scratching my head, I added. At least I've managed to have her promise to not overdo with the chores around the castle. I guess it will have to do. Jenna replied slightly disappointed before changing subjects. You know, the way you've been walking around and behaving, I can see that Tywin's expectations for you weren't unfounded. I see a little bit of both Jaime and Tyrion in you, mostly the parts that I know he admires in them, even if he isn't willing to admit. Thanks for the compliment. Growing up with Uncle Jaime, and now living together with Uncle Tyrion, I can see the reason behind your words. I told her in gratitude. They have plenty of admirable qualities. Ah, and that well-mannered way of speaking. She placed her hands on my cheeks. Reminds me of your mother, though in her case I could always know to be the telltale sign that she was up to no good. She laughed before hugging me gently. Monetary forgetting that we weren't allowed, this grown-up woman all of a sudden got flustered and quickly said. Oh, I almost forgot. Hey, I received a letter from my son. He and the Blackfish, alongside the few recruits that joined them, have just arrived on the Riverlands and have begun patrolling the roads. That's good to hear, I'm sure grandfather will be pleased. I said, still surprised by the way she had just behaved, but still sharp enough to notice she forgot to mention Bronn and Lothor were also away. I so often underestimated the power behind each individual title I had unlocked, my Bard features in regard to social skills being a prime example of that, given that it has just reached level 10. Yup, stupidly broken. No shit, Sherlock. I mentally facepalmed at no one in particular. Though to balance it a little, I only got boosts to my bardic inspiration. which apparently allowed me to influence others even passively, better revitalize and soothe wounded allies, and even boost healing and offensive spells. What the actual fuck? Back to Jenna. Poor woman, she must be going crazy realizing how I made her feel, despite our age gap. Especially since I wasn't disguised as my other identities to make it less weird. I thought, watching Jenna take her leave while a little embarrassed with all of what just happened. If only I had this charisma while I was back at the Red Keep, I'm sure Mother and I would have bonded much quicker than we did. Noticing Sandor's weird face from the corner of my eye, I got a sudden feeling of deja vu, which followed a mental note of realization that aided me to come up with a quick excuse. Don't look at me like that, I'm just as confused as you. Turning to face my undead minion, I continued. I hope you know that it's all your fault. That comment flew completely over my undead knight's head, but Sandor was immediately inclined to believe in me. Thankfully, the younger Clegane was just so oblivious to most social interactions, caring only about killing and brutalizing others, that he didn't have any reason to doubt me, a prince who obviously was being raised to play the Game of Thrones. You know she's a married woman, if you two are going to get at it, make sure to not be caught in the act. I spoke once again to my undead, not really sounding like an ignorant child, only to use my minor illusion to make it seem that it was answering me. I apologize for the inconvenience, my prince. The hallucinative sound sounded just like the voice I had for my knight's persona. It's merely a one-sided relationship, since I have no intentions of getting myself involved into unnecessary trouble. I accepted his response once Sandor shrugged as if it was none of his business. Phew, mission accomplished. It was all the easier thanks to my divination magic. As we resumed our walk around Castle Rock, I began reflecting. I was still getting used to the whole important thing, seeing glimpses into the future, noticing all the different possible timelines and attempting to actively course-correct my present to have one of them to become true. It brings an entire new meaning to the idea of making my own luck by either guessing or influencing the results I got from repeatedly throwing dice. I mentally remarked. Unfortunately, it didn't always work like I'd intended it to, mostly due to the minimal details I got from those glimpses and insights allowing me to only influence so much before the events transpired, but having a vague comprehension of the future was still better than having no clue about it. Especially if I wasn't cursed with the awful trope of having the future set on stone, which made all my efforts to stop it from happening being in actuality the cause of it in the end. On a second note, I had dedicated most of my daily focus needlessly detecting the flow of mana surrounding me and setting destinations for my guiding arrow to every brief walk I made just to grind those cantrips. Naming the first my magic sense, I found it so amusing to constantly practice, almost as if I had just developed a Byakugan since it wasn't restricted to my line of sight. And the second, while suffering the most of the immersion breaking problem, was quickly evolving to be able to find the quickest way towards any known destination and finding more paths towards it. Probably due to all of that grinding, divination magic seems to be naturally getting less costly for me than the other schools. Almost to the point of making my first class spell cost no mana point at all, which I could see as a way of finally getting a reliable use of my tempestuous magic feature. On top of that, guidance had made the idea of raising an army of intelligent soldiers a worthwhile endeavor to strive for, since they were the best candidates to learn skills from me. Not forgetting that I couldn't also cast it on myself. Finally, I mentally shouted, since my player's mind insisted on keeping me so stoical. Rage momentarily boosted my power and endurance stats, Action Surge boosted my mobility, Sneak Attack my stealth, now I had a spell to give me an extra edge with the intelligence stat. To the surprise of none, mastering the basics of new schools of magic with my awakened spellbook was undoubtedly beneficial to raising my wizard level, twice, and my sorcerer title, once. Level 8 wizard and level 7 sorcerer. Yes baby. I celebrated, not bothered at all that I didn't unlock any feature, only more sorcery points, since it made me hopeful that something big was on its way. That leads me to what else I've been doing during my spare time. Other than constantly checking on the growth of my legion, I continuously took the opportunity to bond with Sandor, Tyrion and Davin, the latter two who were for all intents and purposes the next lords of Castle Rock and Lannisport respectively. A few days ago, I swear to you, I heard Tyrion asking, "Dear nephew, I'm sorry for my lack of subtlety, but could you find a position for me to be of use? Whatever is the deal between you and my father, he clearly respects you. And it appears to be rubbing off on me. Well, I'll be damned." After my ultimatum, Tywin Lannister actually dialed down on his hostility towards Tyrion, perhaps finally understanding his son's usefulness as he aided me with my royal legion. As for Davin, despite our 10-year age gap, we became close friends. He was on the verge of becoming a full-fledged legionnaire, having gained some experience patrolling the Westerland's coast, but since he was the future Lord of Lannisport, I had a different plan for him. Once I even had Davin switch places with Tyrion, leaving my uncle to learn more about the logistics of war from Tyget and have Garyon guide him around the training of my Marines. The fact that Davin's sisters were constantly asking about me made it a little awkward for him to interact with me sometimes, but thankfully Davin wasn't as protective as Uncle Jaime was of Cersei, so unless I went out of my way to disrespect them, I believe we will be fine. Come again. I blinked at his revelation. You heard me right. Davin chuckled while rubbing his temples. I was nicknamed the Sea Lion of Lannisport. His sisters giggled at his words, not maliciously, more in a teasing sense. Well, your house banner, a lion and an anchor over the sea, is basically that. I told him not really that impressed, but also not interested in making him feel bad about it. Come now, Don. He laughed, pointing at the banner his mother had so proudly sewn on his cloak. We both know how sea lions look like, and that's not it. That might be true, I shrugged. But I've also never heard of a dragon with 3 heads roaming Westeros, and yet the entire continent lived in fear of the Targaryens for almost 3 centuries. I encouraged him, suddenly gaining some support from his sisters. Same thing for a lion with golden fur, a falcon that reached the moon, a golden rose that never stops growing stronger, much less a sun pierced by a lance. You wanted to hear my advice, well here it is, wear it like armor so it can never be used to hurt you. This seemed to shut everyone's mouth for a moment, and I could see that Davin was immediately reflecting over my words. I almost expected him to pull up a paper and start to take notes. Oh, and for the old gods and new, go thank your mother. She could have just ordered a servant or paid a tailor to make it, but she decided instead to make it for you herself. I gave him my personal wake-up call while sneakily using my bardic inspiration. Standing by my side, witnessing all the inspiration I've been handing out, Sandor was constantly reminded about what type of person he had sworn to protect and serve. You disagree? I casually asked him after leaving Davin for his own thoughts. It's not my place to question princes. Sandor shrugged before momentarily glimpsing at my disguised undead knight, waiting to hear his answer, only to growl at his silence. To be honest, at first dealing with his cynicism almost gave me the idea that he would be more comfortable with a stupid vicious prince that would rather call him dog and have him brutalizing peasants than someone that would lead him to a better path by questioning his preconceptions. But it was nice of you. If not a little, bloody annoying. The younger Clegane grunted, immediately pretending to not really care about it. Shit, a family that cares for you is not something to be taken for granted. You never know. Thanks, Clegane, I replied. As you can see, my initial picture of him being a misunderstood Sunere proved true as I insisted on treating him with respect and showed concern for his well-being. After spending months with the 3 Westlanders, I eventually got to trust them enough to add them to my party, though I still refrained from sharing my broken perks. Nor did I reveal anything to them, like my magic, setting without warning the parameters to expel them from my party if they ever went against me. So from this moment onwards, the lesser version of my system gave them a great advantage over regular people. Though I had to bring forth a matter that has been puzzling me ever since I got a broader view of one of my companions. Flashback begins. You want me to do what? My bookish uncle asked rather loudly as we stood in a large courtyard. Sighing at his antics, I run towards him, naturally surprising him to the point of making him trip backwards, before jumping and flipping over him. Oh, haha, must be so nice being already taller than me. He spoke rather sarcastically as he dusted his clothes off. I did warn you, I replied before offering him a hand to stand up. Fine, he accepted my hand. So this is the reason you brought me here. You want to train me? No, I will be training you. A new voice joined us. It was my monk persona, with his silver hair and purple eyes. And who are you? Tyrion finally asked before we began. Originally, in the books, Tyrion had stood out as an interesting case for me. The reason I say this was because there were contrary events that made one wonder in confusion. At the start of the books, he was sitting up on a perch, on a ledge above the door of the common room of Winterfell. How he got up there was not really explained. He doesn't seem strong enough to be a climber. Are you trying to kill me? Tyrion exclaimed while halting his progress on the workout I had planned for him. I'm not entirely sure that you've noticed, but I got shorter legs than you too. He says that now, but in the beginning of the books he jumps off, does a spin thingy in the air, lands on his hands and then rolls himself upright. The problem isn't in your anatomy. I told him disguised as a Valyrian monk. It's in your bad habits. Drinking and a lazy way of life will lead you into an early grave. I will let you know that being drunk all the time is not that easy. If it was, everyone would do it. Wiping the sweat off his forehead, Tyrion argued back. As for having an early grave, have I told you about Let me guess, you want to die of old age living exactly how you do now. Ask any maester how unlikely that will be if you can barely do a few laps around this area. I casually told him, actually enjoying myself for having this sort of moment with a character I knew so much about. I don't mean to be rude, my lord, but it is known people with your stature already have plenty of disposition for health disorders. Will you be willing to risk it? This time Tyrion remained silent and began running again. For a dwarf, he could be very agile and athletic if he set his mind to. My first guess was that he required the appropriate motivation. But not only mobility, he also took part in a few battles throughout the books. On the way to the Eyrie, he kills a man with an axe and takes his half-helm, following it up by dodging the men with swords and attacking them with the axe. In the Riverlands, he fought with his mountain clansmen in the vanguard, somewhat differently to what the TV show led us to believe. He took a blow to the shoulder but uses his battle axe pretty well to kill a few grown men. Tyrion also takes part in the Battle of the Blackwater as well. The half-man couldn't possibly be bad in combat if he could take on grown men and defeat them. Wooden weapons. Do you expect me to engage in battle? Tyrion raised an eyebrow. I thought you were training me so that I could live more healthily. Why risk my chances in combat? You never know. We live in a dangerous world and you appear to be quite rich. I shrugged. Never heard of someone that lived up to his 80s without ever facing danger. If I were you, I would rather learn how to avoid getting killed off so easily. Fine. He accepted the wooden short swords before looking around for some extra gear. But I want some protection. Wouldn't want to ruin this handsome face of mine. Tyrion was by no means a skilled knight or as talented as his brother Jaime was in his youth. However, he did things at times which were surprising and were never expected of him. He doesn't kill in all of those cases from behind either, relying only on dirty fighting and surprise attacks. Tyrion kills some of them face to face in open combat. Other events which seem contrary to his skill and strength were when he could barely walk up the stairs or keep up with people walking as his legs continuously cramped. To me something never seemed to add up. Sometimes he does seem like a demon monkey who can do things whenever he needs to, the rest of the time he has the persona of a more restricted and limited person. From the first time we met, I've had big questions over his true physical abilities, thinking he was in fact strong and not as limited as he seemed originally. Tyrion did take on the Stoneman at the Rye one as well. Someone truly weak with no ability or strength would not risk such acts. He had more ability than regular readers of the books and viewers of the TV show were led to believe. Watch this, nephew. It's a trick I learned from my uncle Garyon, so I'm passing it down to you. Tyrion spoke to my illusion before performing several cartwheels, only to drop to the ground very dizzy. Ouch, shouldn't have done that. I merely shook my head at his antics before thinking to myself. Sometimes I forget that I'm mentally older than you, uncle. It was like he transformed during battle, not only by adrenaline rush, but he actually became more skilled. However, once the battle was over, he returned to his normal whining self about his legs. To me, he was somewhere in between the frail yet agile children of the forest hobbits, and the slow yet strong Ibbenese dwarfs, and it would be very fortunate if I managed to direct him to a similar path I had Rhaenys take. So I decided to practice alongside him some acrobatic moves and challenge him to shoot a crossbow, which was very pleasant since Tywin was no longer hell-bent on prohibiting him from acting like that. I never got the appeal of crossbows, Tyrion said as he was about to take his first shot. Feeling the recoil and witnessing how deep the bolt he shot got into the targets we were practicing on, he grinned all of a sudden. Well, scratch that, he chuckled, immediately attempting to reload it again. Tywin better watch out this time. I suddenly remembered. A pity both Jalabar and Syrio were still busy patrolling the countryside of the Westerlands, otherwise I would have included them into Tyrion's training. Hell, Thoros could certainly learn a little bit about going easy on the wine. Flashback transition. As for Davin, I wanted him to become the next coming of Jaime Lannister, without the Kingsguard and Kingslayer matters, as just like my uncle he was expected to rule his own house. Up, down, right, left. I said as my knight persona while intercepting every single attack from the heir of Lannisport. Now block. Ah, he shouted while being knocked back a meter after my punch met his shield, leaving him prone on the ground. Remember, in combat, posture is everything. He heard me saying before feeling the blunt tip of my sword at his neck. Fighting petty criminals, untrained and with low-quality equipment, is just the beginning for you. Got it, he said immediately standing up again, not noticing the healing properties of my passive effects, focusing instead on my superior strength while raging. Again, I ordered. Davin was much obliged by our constant sparring matches, with me being very insistent he mastered the basics of combat before anything else. In return, I finally got someone to help me practice with the shield, and occasionally with long-reaching weapons as well. Now the spear. I want to see you keeping your distance from me while still attacking. I told him while adjusting the ruined bronze gauntlets I was wearing. I even got Sandor to help me out practicing with both Lannisters on dirty fighting tactics. Now Clegane, the three of us will fight simultaneously. Whoever remains standing wins the match. I told him, already knowing it would mostly be me against the two of them. As for my own progress, I've managed through great effort to level up. Once. Yeah, the sudden abstinence of constant killing through my night raids left me with only my sporadic quests to gain experience, and made me aware that I was growing overdependent on the murder hobo's path. I still had to maintain the illusion that the stranger was still roaming the streets of King's Landing, at least for just another year so it wouldn't be too on the nose for the likes of Varys. Flashback ends. At Tywin's Solar. Hand him the letter. Lord Lannister ordered his own maester. Here it is, my prince. The old man bowed. Now leave us. Tywin added. The maester of House Lannister bowed in respect again before leaving. Opening the letter I noticed Tywin's gaze upon me. Recently I've been exchanging some letters with those I left behind, but nothing too revealing since I didn't completely trust the maesters acting as intermediate mailers. Even Pycelle, the Lannister loyalist, wasn't free of suspicion. News from the capital, Tywin finally asked once I finished reading everything. Things appear to have gotten a little boring since I left the capital. I told him rather dismissively. Sure, I had safer means to know that the stranger was still scaring the shit out of criminals and corrupt gold cloaks, with both Tobo and Chataya's business having prospered thanks to some well-thought-out management. And that the alchemists were still rebuilding while studying my infusions in secret, looking for ways of mass-producing it. Even Elise sent me a subtle encrypted letter that didn't stand out while also informing me both of her and Rhaenys' well-being. Which honestly was a relief. Elise had successfully managed to get Littlefinger to tutor her on the financial matters he had been working on as Master of Coin, with the intention of finding incriminating evidence of his selfish schemes, and working with Rhaenys to steal back all the money he stole from the crown. Rhaenys pitched this idea as her own to Varys, in order to have his support and trust, and explained it as a way of simultaneously weakening my father's rule from the inside while also saving enough money to support her brother, once he came to retake the Iron Throne. Becoming in debt with the Iron Bank of Bravos was something that even Tywin couldn't so casually dismiss. And both the Master of Coin and Whispers were taking advantage of my father's lack of restraint and constant disregard to his hands-wise counsel. Little did they know that I was taking advantage of them as well. My parents seemed to be doing just fine. I finally said something else, as I didn't want to alienate the old lion. My mother wrote to me a little about my siblings' well-being. Cersei wasn't subtle with her plans to have me care for them in case her relationship with Jaime ever came to light. Thankfully I could make use of it to have them grow loyal to me instead of her. Half-siblings. Tywin suddenly corrected, with a shadow of disgust hanging on his eyes, still so used to always dominating conversations. Technicalities. I shrugged. The sort of that could ruin everything you've been planning for your house. And leaving me powerless to publicly defend my mother and uncle. That seems to be enough to shut his mouth. As I was saying, it appears that Lan was still attempting to follow my footsteps, but isn't skilled nor intelligent enough to be taught at the same pace that I was. Which isn't that bad, given that I know he is already a cut above regular people. I explained out loud, merely getting a nod of acknowledgement from Tywin. What surprises me though, is that Uncle Stannis has shown some interest in him and is willing to have him visit Dragonstone. Well, color me impressed. If not a little envious as well. I thought, with all that dragonglass laying around, who knows how great my progress would be with my sorcerer title. Forget about the magical dungeon under it. Stannis. Tywin finally broke his short-lived silence. The future king of Westeros should be raised here in the Westerlands. Like you. And risk having his claim put to question once my father dies. I made a rhetorical question. Nonsense. Having Uncle Stannis grow fond of him will make him doubt any rumors about Lan's legitimacy as ruler and heir of my father. Tywin stared at me for a brief moment, probably considering the logic behind my words. Very well. As for my sweet little Anna, I once again proceeded. She has changed quite a bit. It seems my absence was necessary to have her behave more like a lady. Well, without me around to spoil her, I guess it was inevitable. Just like her mother, Tywin remarked, somewhat nostalgic about the past. If only I knew back then. Are you repented for not having separated her from Jaime earlier? Or perhaps having managed to get her married to the late Prince Rhaegar? Don't waste your time with what-ifs. I dismissed his regrets. Since I will be traveling tomorrow to the Reach, let's instead plan for the future. More visions. He raised an eyebrow, and I nodded, completely confident in my deception skills. The next day, Pia, or as I've personally nicknamed her, Pretty Pia, was the servant of house wench who used to work in the buttery at Harrenhal before I convinced her to tag along. Which weirdly enough, for multiple reasons, was easier than I had expected. I suppose if Sandor was allowed to murder the butcher's son without Eddard Stark's approval, there wasn't much Lady Went could do when the crown prince took an interest for an orphan servant. Don't get me wrong, I had no intention of forcing her to do anything. Pia had Rainie's age, 9 years old, and Elisa's sweetness, so it wasn't that hard to believe that we got along almost instantaneously. Despite being older than me, I was the one mostly taking care of her, while also polishing some of my social skills on her. I had taught her a little bit of cooking and cleaning, in order to make her more than a mere burden with a pretty face, but I also encouraged the side of her that yearned for learning while developing her taste for stories and songs. My Pretty Pia might not match the player of the game one had Elise set on becoming in order to replace Littlefinger, but she will at least become a competent and loyal agent for Elise and I to make use of. And although I was nowhere near falling in love with the little girl, the same could not be said about her in regards to me. Oh, my prince, please continue one of your wonderful tales. Pia asked while chuckling rather cutely. I've been constantly having dreams of what will happen next. I raised an eyebrow at her request and stopped strumming the chords of my lute. Regardless of how long I've been pretending to be just a kid, it was still strange, if not a little jarring, to occasionally keep up the act. And yes, I've carried on with using some of my previous life's knowledge to gain the reputation of a natural storyteller and singer with great talent and creativity. Especially when cute girls were involved. So sue me, I don't really care. Sure, my dear, which one? I questioned as Shadow subtly came out of a dark corner on my carriage and leapt only to rest on my lap while purring. And please, I've already told you to call me Dawn. Understood, I mean, Dawn. Hey, let's see. Pia pondered for a brief moment while making an adorable face of concentration before replying. I find the tale about the monster slayer mutants a little too scary. Same thing about the one with cursed knights standing against dark creatures rising from beneath the earth in hordes. So I will go with the one that has the magical rings and the pretty elves. Oh, I see you appreciate the classical struggle between good and evil. I smiled back and allowed her to pat Shadow. Yes, Dawn. Pia nodded energetically before awkwardly correcting herself. It's much more exciting than the old and plain stories of heard around Harrenhal. Okay then, I remarked before making myself comfortable again on the carriage that was leading us toward the reach and putting away my lute. Incidentally, I hope you found the change of landscape just as pleasant. Yes, Dawn. She nodded with a sweet smile. My previous home always gave me awful nightmares from its gloomy view. But since I've joined you, I've been seeing one beautiful castle after another, and countless chivalrous knights. Hey, I appreciate the compliment, but my legionnaires aren't knights. I chuckled while patting her on the head, watching as her smile didn't waver even for a moment. Well, at least a vast majority of them. But aren't they brave men training and patrolling the lands daily to make it a more secure and prosperous place? Pia argued with a confident expression. After I conceded her point, she continued. See, I know that one day most of them will accomplish great feats and become heroic knights themselves. And you will outshine all of them. I winked at her optimistic opinion of me while smiling. I'll be satisfied if my soldiers were competent enough to be of use in the wars to come, instead of mere red shirts. I thought dismissively for a brief moment. Pia was too young to understand that my Royal Legion currently had too many men seeking fame and fortune. Granted, I made sure to admit only really skilled and talented fighters, but most of them envisioned gaining knighthood as their ticket for an easier and more privileged life, not a path or cause for them to devote their lives. Even after having the requirements for recruitment set much higher than it was reasonable for someone seeking to build an army, the really exceptional individuals were really rare to find. I've come to label them as variant humans. Which was, in my opinion, in much better taste than to start calling them something weird like chosen ones, or main characters. Accepting that others that weren't me could also have some sort of plot armor wasn't that comforting, as it could prove to be troublesome if leveraged against my interests. Besides, words such as variant humans also reminded me of pleasant times playing RPGs, where it was clear that humans overcame their short lifespans by becoming overachievers conquerors. Regardless, hearing the low yet constant sound of marching legionnaires outside my carriage, I began recalling everything I've been telling Pia thus far about the Lord of the Rings, with a few spins to make it more comprehensible for Westerosi standards. While also making sure to not villainize the pursuit of magical power and adding some of the headcanons introduced by the games. Yeah, heresy to some, but I really enjoyed the journey of the fallen ranger and his vindictive wraith partner. We also shared some of the food I've prepared beforehand myself and continued to delve into the fantastical world Tolkien had come up with. Eventually Tyrion got bored of his own book and decided to join us at one point. Meanwhile Sandor was busy testing Davin's horse riding skills alongside the other scouts. A new division I've been thinking about. Dear nephew, if I didn't know how dear I am to you, I would certainly consider these dwarves and, what were their names again? Hobbits. Halflings. As your way of mocking me. Tyrion remarked with a teasing smile. I smiled back and hinted for him to continue. But since you do know I care. Hey, honestly, I can't decide which one I like the best. Dwarfs with kingdoms rich in ancient grandeur, halls carved into the roots of mountains, the echoing of picks and hammers in deep mines and blazing forges, and a commitment to clan and tradition does appeal to my wish fulfillment fantasies as a proud Lannister. But, the little lion instinctively reached for his wineskin, only to decide against drinking from it, probably recalling my previous pep talk. If I was even more honest, either having the comfort of a cozy home or being lured by the open road and the wide horizon to discover the wonders of new lands and peoples as a life goal was a fair enough purpose to me. You are far too modest, my lord. Pia complimented him with a friendly chuckle. Having shared moments with Tyrion Lannister before even hearing of his reputation, added to the fact that most children were so innocent and oblivious about those kinds of matters, my pretty Pia had nothing against him. Even though she still flinched under Sandor's stare, I was slowly making him less of a creep with my subtle suggestions. Ah, you flatter me with your kind words, sweetie. Tyrion faked humbleness and gestured for me to continue. But do go on, dear nephew. If I'm not mistaken, the Fellowship of the Ring was dissolved and the ring-bearer, alongside his companion, were on their own. Indeed. But before we make another stop for the Legionnaires to rest, I would like to have another match of Sybass with you. I asked in return while I sent Shadow to rest on Pia's lap. Deal. Tyrion happily accepted before clearing his throat. Picking up my waterskin from my inventory, I offered it to him. Thirsty. As much as I appreciate your impressive sleight of hand tricks, my thirst can't be quenched by water. Tyrion remarked with a dismissive gesture while confusing Pia, and by his posture, I could see he was sore from working out. Besides, you will be speaking for quite a while, so save it for later. If you insist. I shrugged before proceeding with my tale. Despite its simplicity, this method of subtly practicing my bardic inspiration without requiring a crowded tavern has proven to be exactly what I needed. Just as I made sure to teach Elise about the power of eloquent oratory, I also followed the interesting quote on the botched and rushed ending to the TV series. What unites people? My short uncle Tyrion, who was currently intrigued by the adventures J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, would have asked before answering it himself. Armies. Gold. Flags. Number. Stories. There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it. There was undeniable power in stories. That's all history was. The best tales. The ones that lasted long enough for everyone to know about them enough to continue to pass on, at least. Which might as well be mine. Having said that, what interested me the most was the prospect of taking Bran's place and becoming the next three-eyed raven. If the TV show was right, I would be this world's memory. The keeper of all of the stories. The wars, weddings, births, massacres, famines, triumphs and defeats. Basically warden of the past. I wonder if altering the past was just another one of the TV show's creative liberties with the source material, but if proven to be accurate, the possibilities would certainly be limitless. As well as the risks, but interesting enough, that's a concern for the future. Currently both my sorcerer and druid titles were my best hope of ever having a chance of gaining the other powers the children of the forest were said to wield in legends, with wizard and artificer promising more to deliver the secrets of old Valyria and the mythical empire of the Dawn. Speaking with nature was a weird thing, an experience which I couldn't make head or tails while explaining to others. It's not like plants, animals or even rocks suddenly became smarter than they already were so to have a proper conversation. Especially the rocks, who despite their ludicrous longevity were basically stagnant from my point of view. Hearing mainly whispers about the topography of the area nearby, if the soil was fertile or not, where the minerals were sturdier and where the wildlife passed by. This gave me hopes of eventually becoming an extraordinary tracker and explorer. And while most animals possessed all of the five senses, which allowed for a better understanding between us, plants only shared their emotions and current health. Which at least aided me with handling taming animals, given how clearer my commands were, and practicing agriculture armed with the knowledge of what my photosynthetic friend requires most. So my alchemic fertilizer could be made to order after learning everything about the types of plants and soils. But it was still a work in progress for now. Back to my storytelling. Once in a while, I noticed a few reactions that amused me. Oh, how romantic, Pia remarked with a blush. She certainly had great admiration for the underdog arc the hobbits found themselves in, but most predictably also a certain adoration of the romance between Aragorn and Arwen. She even had conflicted feelings with the introduction of Éowyn, finding her a lovely character, but at the same time still pioneering the role of shipping fangirl in this world. Their love is so beautiful. Pia gushed again. She would actually forsake her immortality just for him. Her father has to acknowledge their bond. However, Tyrion wasn't that interested in the romance and drama, occasionally rolling his eyes at Pia's exaggerated enthusiasm, though not to the point of maliciousness. He was instead rather engrossed by the world-building aspects of the tale. I've been thinking about mithril, a precious silvery metal, stronger than steel but much lighter in weight. Tyrion interrupted my narration of the story. Basically Valyrian steel, right? Pia's eyes shone with curiosity, probably expecting to hear more in-depth explanations about the magical world of Middle-earth. In a sense, I casually shrugged, watching as Shadow began to stretch herself on Pia's lap, balancing with the movement of our carriage. Only that mithril could be mined out of the ground. Why didn't you make the veins of ore to be fortified just like Castle Rock? Tyrion showed the telltale signs of frustration that comes from applying real-world logic into fiction. If it is several times more valuable than gold, why sell it for riches? Why not raise a small army equipped with it and take all the riches by force? To be honest, because almost everyone wanted it just as much. Fortifying such a site would require considerable external influence and power to fend off everyone else who might challenge you for it, for example a tyrant Dark Lord. I revealed my personal opinion on the matter. Even if weapons and armors made out of mithril could be of the best quality in comparison, with ancient craftsmanship techniques capable of creating legendary objects out of ordinary materials, it just wasn't worth the risk of losing it all in battle. Or worse, have your soldiers desert you. After all, just like in real life, castle-forged steel could kill and be protected well enough from regular opponents with considerably less risks. Hey, makes sense. But still, I can't say I wouldn't like to try it. He admitted with a smile before signaling for me to continue, since we still had quite the journey ahead of us. Walking down the coast road into the Reach was as pleasant of a journey as one would find in this continent, as the hills and mountains of the Westerlands were behind us, still visible on the horizon. To the right, the sunset sea twinkled in the summer sun, making me curious about the possibility of discovering new lands, and ahead fields stretched off as far as the eye could see. Even shortly after winter, melons, peaches and fire plums could already be seen beginning to grow everywhere, just as Pycelle had described during my lessons about the Seven Kingdoms. Which really explained why most of the men enlisting in my Royal Legion knew a little bit of cultivating lands. It literally grew everywhere around here with seemingly no effort, so it made sense for them to learn one thing or another in such an environment. As my retinue got closer to Highgarden, we were greeted with the view of fields after fields of roses of every imaginable color. The scenery was lush and verdant, and the air hung heavy with the scent of flowers and herbs, for this truly was the Garden of Westeros, and rising up before me, was my first destination after leaving the Westerlands. Highgarden. If you imagine what a castle ought to look like, especially found in fairy tales and high fantasy settings, it was surely something like it. And just like I did with every castle I've visited, I was definitely taking notes about how to better rebuild Harrenhal to surpass its former glory. Highgarden was built for beauty as much as defense. As it sat atop a hill with white stone arcing into the sky, around it were 3 curtain walls, each taller and thicker than the last, and inside, towers and colonnades were visible. With all this in apparent cultivated harmony with nature, ivy climbed the walls everywhere, birds nest in trees and the river Mander passed majestically before it. Highgarden style itself was the heart of chivalry, and indeed we could sight many knights here, practicing for any tourneys that would be hosted here or in nearby towns. There was also a healthy toing and froing of people as my retinue drew nearer, small folk heading out to or returning from the fields, traders passing through and Tyrell servants about their business. With all the bustle and beauty of our surroundings, it was easy to underestimate the power of House Tyrell that was being displayed here. Then again, perhaps that was the exact intention. When discussing the mightiest families of Westeros, most might bring up the rich Lannisters or the Targaryens with their dragons, or even the Starks and their vast kingdom. But the Tyrells were often overlooked. They shouldn't be. The Lannisters may be the richest family, but the Tyrells were the second richest with their fertile lands and abundance of farms. Highgarden may not be a mighty city, but it stood on the crossroads between the 3 largest cities of Westeros. Them being Lannisport, King's Landing and Aldtown. Going from one to another, one will almost certainly pass through here. But don't forget that the largest army in Westeros was the Army of the Reach, being capable of raising a host twice as large as the inflated numbers of the Lannisters after hiring several mercenaries. Also, one of the three largest fleets was the Redwin fleet here in the Reach, which might have assumed the first place once the Iron and Golden fleet got destroyed after the Greyjoy Rebellion, and the Royal fleet joined Stannis during the War of the Five Kings. And the region that grew and exported the most amount of food to elsewhere was also the Reach, even despite their difficulties to adapt to the shorter seasons. House Tyrell might preside over beauty and chivalry, but they were undeniably just as strong. Growing strong, as their motto announced so proudly to the world. Not that House Tyrell had been the paramount house in the Reach for a long time by Westerosi standards. Highgarden itself was founded by Garth the Gardener, that legendary figure who was the eldest son of Garth Greenhand, the High King of the First Men. House Gardener, Garth the Gardener's descendants, then reigned from Highgarden as kings of the Reach for thousands of years. They were said to have ruled from a living throne, called the Oakenseat, which grew from an oak tree planted by Garth Greenhand himself. Sadly, the Oakenseat was chopped into pieces and burned by the forces of a Dornish king who sacked Highgarden late into the reign of the then senile King Garth X Gardener, otherwise I was confident to earn another druid level. A curious piece of trivia was that they had two crowns, one of vine and flowers that was worn during peacetime and another of bronze or iron thorns for war. The Gardeners expanded their territory over time, but it was during peaceful periods such as the golden reign of Garth VII Gardener, which apparently lasted for 81 years, that Highgarden and the Reach truly prospered. As with all noble families, they of course eventually had to deal with the Andal invasion, and they chose the route of assimilation rather than confrontation. Under the leadership of three kings, one after the other, who became known as the Three Sage Kings, the Andals and their customs were adopted wholesale in the Reach. The faith of the Seven became the established religion, knights and chivalry were not just accepted but celebrated. Andal craftspeople were actively encouraged to settle and share knowledge and skills with the local population. And to cement it all, intermarriage between the First Men and the Andals became commonplace. Finally, this is where the Tyrells came in, because House Tyrell was founded by Sir Alistair Tyrell, an Andal knight who was welcomed into the service of House Gardener. To my understanding, he was the Tyrell equivalent of Lan the Clever, if you will. His descendants rose to become stewards of the Gardeners and intermarried with them perhaps 10 times over the years. So when House Gardener was destroyed on the Field of Fire during the Targaryen conquest, they were the obvious choice to take over. How fortunate for them, I suppose. But enough history for the moment. I certainly could go for days, but decided against it. As my retinue was just about to enter this ancient yet beautiful and well-kept castle, with Sandor and Davin leading my marching legionaries on their own horses while bearing my Royal Legion's banner. Passing through the gatehouse of the first curtain wall, we were faced with a rosebush hedge. As we went further in, it became apparent that this was a maze. A couple of influential figures that were expecting us bowed in respect. Most visitors usually paused by this point, uncertain of which way to go in order to get to the next gatehouse until some guard came to inform them, but I was greeted cordially by Lord Tyrell and his older sons. The Tyrells the TV series completely forgot about, Willis and Garland Tyrell, currently 15 and 14 years old respectively. Even if they were both still taller than me, the gap between us was smaller than the one between me and Davin. It's an honor to receive you in my humble castle, my prince. Mace Tyrell spoke jovially with a bow, despite his appearance being more reminiscent of how my father was supposed to turn into before the start of the books. It hasn't been a year since we've last met and you already look taller. Your father's blood is undoubtedly serving you well. Ha ha. Both Willis and Garland followed their father's example as the Tyrells' guards bowed silently behind them. Thanks for the welcoming, I replied back, more confident in the few inches of height I've gained since my 6th name day. Stormlanders are known for their quality as warriors. They indeed are, my prince, Mace said with a smile, before motioning for his older children to introduce themselves. I don't think you've had the chance to properly meet my boys. Willis wasn't a cripple yet, showing no signs of a bad leg. Canonically, during his first tourney, he would enter as a squire of a young age due to his father's wishes and competed against Prince Baron Martell of Dornay, who knocked Willis from his horse. The Tyrell heir's foot would be caught in his stirrup as he fell, and have his own horse on top of him, crushing his leg and leaving him a cripple. My prince, the eldest son said politely before stepping forward. My name is Willis Tyrell. I'm a great admirer of your initiative in raising a force of elite soldiers to guard the realm. Mace held out a chuckle. He obviously wasn't impressed by our small numbers. Thanks, but truth be told, I've been mostly relying on my mother's family to make my ideas into reality. I opted for humbleness. My brief observe described Willis as intelligent, studious, educated, kind and enthusiastic about breeding the finest hawks, hounds and horses in the 7 kingdoms. Willis was also described as mild and courtly, fond of reading books and looking at the stars, which was a funny piece of trivia, but I'm sure I could make use of it. As Willis interpreted my words as wise modesty, his younger brother, similar in appearance to his older brother, although slightly taller and more broadly built, was the next to step forward. From their body language the two weren't all that close to one another, as the Tyrell brothers knew where they stood. Not that they hated each other, quite far from it. Only that when Garland was allegedly plump in his youth, Willis shrewdly dubbed him the gallant to save him from the indignity that befell an uncle of theirs, nicknamed Garth the Gross. But it didn't seem to sit well for Garland ever since. My prince, my name is Garland Tyrell and it's my goal to one day be accepted as one of your legionnaires. Garland was undoubtedly straightforward with his words. In similar fashion to Bryden Tully, the Blackfish, Garland had his personal coat of arms as two golden roses on green, to denote his status as second son and differentiate himself from Willis. From using observe on him, I got that he had been considering his options for the future for quite a while now. The second son of Lord Tyrell would turn into an exceptionally skilled swordsman, preferring to train against 3 or 4 swordsmen, so as to better prepare himself for actual battle. Uncertainty over the Night's Watch current condition prevented him from throwing his life away by vowing to fight alongside criminals and exiled traitors. Though I wouldn't disregard the notion of him simply hating the cold, like most people did. The Kingsguard Order might have better prestige, but even without being around to witness their decadence, he was smart enough to understand that it wasn't a position where he would be expected to regularly fight. And if glory and fame were everything to him, he would have ended up just like Loras. My Royal Legion was by far the best option, at least on paper, since we were still less than a year active or that our influence barely reached past the Westerlands into the kingdoms of the Riverlands and the Reach. I look forward to hearing about your future accomplishments. I finally answered Garland's bold statement. I will definitely have to keep an eye on you too. We continued to share courtesies on our way through the legendary Briar Labyrinth, which was undeniably beautiful and I'm sure a diverting way to waste a few hours socializing or stalling time for strategic defense, serving a more practical purpose. The outside of the hedges here were green and filled with flowers and such like, but digging a little deeper and one would find behind them a thick impassable tangle of harsh thorns. An ingenious way of slowing down any invaders who make it past the first curtain wall. But eventually we did make our way through this maze following Mace Tyrell and his sons as we took the tourist route enjoying the view while my legionnaires were allowed to raise camp near the castle's walls. Pia would accompany me to live inside the castle, probably fulfilling some of her innocent fantasies. She would still be busy either studying or completing a few tasks I've assigned to her, but I knew when to let her rest and enjoy the moment. She was, after all, just a child. As for Lord Tyrell, his behavior towards me was a little tricky to deal with. His sons certainly weren't oblivious to that, since I noticed them several times observing me to get a read on my thoughts. Biggest reason being how often Mace enjoyed bragging about how he viewed himself as a great warrior and military general. Regardless if his boasting rested solely on the victory of the Reachman soldiers over my fathers in the Battle of Ashford during his rebellion. If I was being honest, all of it had largely been achieved by Mace's bannerman, Lord Randall Tarley, before the Fat Flower even arrived at the battlefield. But I guess I've all but asked for all of this gloating after mentioning how much of a military force the Stormlands were. Not to mention the understandable reaction at the view of my Royal Legion's unending training drills and strict discipline. The good side was that I took one of their notes and had opted to grow strong without much eccentricities, valuing quality over quantity to a rather comical degree. Overall, our numbers were still really small to worry any lord who could in theory raise a host of more than 10,000 soldiers and that already had their hands full with the frequent winters and the rising number of desperate people willing to become petty criminals. But that benefit wouldn't last for long. Soon enough everyone will be extra cautious with any advantage I might get on the Game of Thrones. Back to the present, on the other side behind the other 2 curtain walls, we were surprised by a rather idyllic scene. Wow, it's so beautiful, Dawn. Pia gushed about. Do elves live here? I don't know, I said, a little amused by her. Let's find out. She gave me one of her cutest smiles before nodding in excitement as we moved forward. There were towers and a keep, but between them and all around us were courtyards and colonnades, groves of trees, fountains. I could even see a man-made waterfall bubbling into a brook which winded its way down the hillside. And if that wasn't enough, around all this, there were artists, singers, and harpists. Exquisite statues were dotted around and everywhere had the sweet smell of roses. Almost reminding me of my otherworldly experience visiting the New Gods, though I feared that nothing in this mortal world could hope to match it. Speaking of it, there was in fact a sept here that was rivaled in its size and beauty only by the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing and, supposedly, the Starry Sept in Old Town. Its walls were not stone, but stained glass with colorful depictions of not just the seven but also legendary heroes like Garth Greenhand and his crown of flowers and vines. And to my great surprise, the godswood here had 3 weirwood trees in its center, each tall and graceful. They were known as the Three Singers and have grown so close over the years that it was hard to see where one ended and another began. Indeed, through Shadow's eyes, who I sent ahead to scout the area more freely, it looked like just one tree, albeit with 3 trunks. This led me to make a mental note of sneaking out during the night and venturing into both the sept and godswood. I ought to be cautious about worshipping the old gods though, especially anywhere outside the north, even if I got a provisional alliance between both pantheons. Taking a moment to observe now at the buildings, as the 3 Tyrells led me and my inner circle of followers, it was clear that they were of 2 distinct styles. These older structures probably date back to the Age of Heroes, being built by the first men that once ruled this land. Tyrion told me while pointing at the squat and square buildings. But the rest, the tall slender towers circular rather than square, must have been built from after the end of the Andal invasion. I replied casually, earning a nod and impressed look from my uncle. Regardless of their origins, the white stone of all of these towers was covered not just in ivy and climbing roses, but also vines of grapes. One never goes for want of a tasty morsel to eat in Highgarden. Tyrion remarked comically, this time to Davin's amusement. Sandor merely remained silent, probably disdaining the entire chivalrous theme of this kingdom, while also staring suspiciously at my disguised undead knight who behaved even more silent than him. Throughout the brief walk, I remained interacting with Lord Tyrell. Since I was the face of my party, the centerpiece of this place was of course the keep, for which the only appropriate word was palatial. From the stones that compose the ground, walls and ceiling, I even got a few snippets of information from what this ancient castle has been through. The Great Hall was airy, with light statues even finer than those outside lined the walls, and though this was clearly still a place for business, where Lord Tyrell administered justice, I couldn't help but wonder whether the true business of running the Reach was done not here but in the nooks and crannies of the castle along the shaded walkways and in passing conversations by fountains. A land of chivalry and fairy tales. I mentally snickered. People may appear to be just taking time and enjoying their surroundings, but the snippets of conversation I heard from passing by suggested this was every bit as much of a political place as King's Landing. Which made me feel at home, if not a little homesick. As I was led deeper into Highgarden, I finally met the other members of the Tyrell family. Lady Tyrell, once known as Aleri Hightower, was tall, dignified and with long silver hair. My prince, Mace's wife greeted me very cordially. My deepest apologies for not receiving you in the front gate. My mother-in-law hasn't been feeling well since the end of last winter and I've been keeping her company. No apologies needed, my lady. At least not from you. I stopped her, surprising everyone with my last statement. Mace, you oaf, shouldn't you be the one concerned about Olenna? She's merely the woman that gave birth to you. Before my thoughts could be understood by everyone else, I bowed my head at Lady Tyrell. I'm really thankful for all of your family's hospitality. I know it must be quite the strain to receive a royal member this close from a harsh winter. Not at all, my prince. The woman stepped forward. You'll always be welcomed here. I truly appreciate that. Smiling at her kindness, I continued. But let me at least assure you that not only have we brought enough provisions to feed the retinue following me, but also enough to share some of our special meals with your family. As the silver-haired lady of Highgarden ended her words of gratitude, I was greeted by the last remaining members of the Tyrell family. Greetings, Your Grace. Proudly said a boy shorter than me while bowing in respect. His etiquette wasn't bad, but he still had plenty to learn. Proof of that was how he mistook my title, not that I planned to point it out and make things awkward. Not that I needed to anyway, since the boy was soon joined by a girl appearing to be just as young, if not younger. Forgive my brother, my prince. Placing a hand on the boy's shoulder while smiling respectfully at me, the boy's sister mimicked his bow while maintaining eye contact. We are both honored to receive such an important guest. Noticing how alike the siblings resembled, I didn't require observe to know who I was dealing with. The honor is all mine. I replied charismatically while acknowledging their welcoming. Please, call me Dawn. And don't worry about such quibbling over semantics, I'm not petty with trivial stuff like that. Both nodded, looking at me with a certain gleam in their eyes. Loras and Marjorie were still too young for me to push any of my plans forward, with him being only a year older than me and her right about my age. They were both noticeably good-looking for kids their age. While Loras' hair was a mass of lazy brown curls and ringlets which tumbled over his large eyes, which were brown, Marjorie had thick, softly curling brown hair and large brown eyes. Although the soon-to-be Knight of Flowers wasn't anywhere near the gallant knight skilled in tournament jousts, I managed to notice a glimpse of his thirst for glory. As for his sister, the shy and sweet little Marjorie already showed a certain amount of shrewdness for political talk. But what I found most amusing about the two was how identical they were despite the fact that they weren't not actual twins, like Cersei and Jaime or Joanna and Lan were. If things were to remain similar to how they went on in the actual story, Loras would fall in love with my uncle Renly, and Marjorie would seek to become queen, either through me or my younger brothers, Lan or the supposed equivalent of Tommen my mother was bound to give birth to. For now, they were still just too young to be anything more than childhood friends to me. After managing to get rid of their father's less than pleasant company so to settle my belongings in the chamber I had reserved for me, I had the older Tyrell brothers to make me company. Fortunately, I had my work cut in half by how much in common they had with Tyrion and Davin. Although Willis was still in perfect health, he had yet to consider trying his hand on the acrobatic stunts I've been training with Tyrion. Not that I wanted him to be that agile without assurances that he would be willing to serve me, but it never hurts to have something to bond over with, especially since his animal handling and training habits were very interesting to me. I've handed my tamed cats, rats and doves to Rhaenys in order to give her another edge while I was away. But since I've yet to find a way to shape Shadow into another type of animal, I've decided to use my wild shape feature and true tongue skill to make up for that. Now, while Davin and Tyrion showed more interest in hawks and eagles, and Sandor pretended to not care for the hounds, I was much more intrigued by Willa's work with the horses. Through Pycelle I've learned basically everything there was to know, from the fundamentals of proper husbandry to training, but it didn't mean I've done it myself. For example, Tobo Mott helped me improve through practice my blacksmithing skill beyond everything that I've learned from an archmaester that was brought to the capital to teach me more theoretical knowledge of blacksmithing. Quite the collection of horses you have. I whistled in surprise after reaching Highgarden's stables, noticing it struck the perfect balance between quantity and quality that both King's Landing and Lannisport still struggled with. Thanks, my prince. Willis nodded in gratitude before turning to face his destriers, coursers and chargers. Would you like to ride one? Only if that isn't a problem for you. I remarked before noticing he even had palfreys, but no sand steeds to be found. Probably one of the many unintentional stances against everything that has to do with Dorne. And please, call me Dawn. It surely isn't, Dawn. Willis reassured me and led me through what basically was my first experience riding a horse. Not really, if we were to account for my previous life, but even back then it wasn't more than a couple of casual experiences. Willis oriented me so well with how I should work alongside the animal to not only have it obey me, but actually understand what I was expecting it to do. It made me wonder how his first joust would end up so badly for him. Perhaps it was that very talent that made his father so eager to sign him on a tourney he wasn't ready for. Though I must say it was quite easy for me to master horse riding as I could actually trade a few words with the animal itself. Nothing too deep like asking if the animal was happy with its life, or similar to how Shadow achieved full sentences, but enough to easily distinguish right from left and faster from slower. Kinda like how I impressed Garyon during his lectures about sailing. As I heard and reacted to the way the wind and sea spoke to me, I immediately got Willa's attention. The Reach was undoubtedly the best place for me to work on my animal army, or cultivating food for that matter, but I had to admit that I was still interested in having the famous sand steeds serving my scouts. Okay, you got me. I mentally raised my hands in surrender. I'm thinking about the Survey Corps from Aot. What's the problem? It's not like I would also get my hands on anything like the vertical maneuvering gear. Not that soon anyway. Regardless, Willis and I would ride a few laps around their castle every morning during my stay, but for now I took the opportunity to know more about his birds of prey and hounds collection. You are a natural with this, Willis said with a surprised expression, noticing how I got to easily befriend even the most troublesome of the beasts in the castle. The animals seem to really like you. Thanks, I just show them that I'm not a threat while also subtly asserting my dominance. I told the heir of Highgarden, fully aware of the double meaning behind my words. Oh, I see. Willis chuckled awkwardly while scratching his nape, not completely sure of the meaning behind it. I had no hurry here, still got plenty of days to work on his view of me. It was during my initial time with Garland, around afternoon on that same day, that things got a little more exciting. Although I've previously compared him to Bryden Tully, he also had signs of Tygett Lannister as well. And as I saw him somehow match Davin's skill during their spar, he had the great idea to invite either Sandor or my disguised undead knight to spar with him as well. Would any of you be willing to test your skill in a friendly match? This made Davin grimace, recalling that he had also done a similar thing after spending enough time with Sandor, who contrary to me wasn't willing to take it easy on him. But Sandor had grown accustomed to how casual I was with matters like this, nor was he expected to shield me from any minuscule sort of threat to my life at any time, so he didn't even gesture threateningly at Garland's casual challenge. Subtly switching places and appearances with my undead knight, speaking before the young Clegane could, I got myself ready to humble this noble boy. Not at all. I accepted his challenge while removing my cloak, immediately noticing the master-at-arms showing signs of worry in regards of supervisioning our spar. The stories of my knight persona's skills were more often than not accurate depictions that most men thought as unreasonable exaggerations. Still, most wouldn't be stupid enough to openly defy it. While I've deemed Davin as a competent fighter in a straight combat during our first sparring, he had been quite stunned by how I circled around him without much effort. But Garland, URG. Excellent parry and repositioning, sir, knight. He remarked, barely dodging one of my casual attacks. That wouldn't have been that effective against someone wearing full plate armor. And your footwork is impeccable. Speaking during our match. Alright, you are a little too arrogant for your own sake, boy. I thought to myself. Regardless if he showed interest in constantly improving his martial prowess in private, Garland was still a highborn lad that deep inside sought to prove his own valor in battle, even if to himself. Despite not enjoying acting like a kid, I definitely appreciated the low expectations people had for me, which made it all so precious whenever I almost got serious. But there's where my other identities came, allowing me a certain level of freedom from consequences to not hold myself down too much. Even without applying my water dance or dirty fighting skills to our match, I easily outmatched him in both raw strength, constitution and agility. As Garland thought he had caught me by surprise with a feint, I became alert to his muscles' movement and predicted that his next strike was aimed at my head. I swung my head back and let the wooden sword pass through the air where my head used to be before I lashed out and stabbed my own wooden weapon at my opponent's throat. Garland twisted his body and somehow managed to get his sword back in front of his body to block the blow. I continued my assault and twirled the blade towards his neck, once again using the momentum of his block against him. Garland smacked it away with the armor on his forearm and moved towards me, intending to draw me in close range. I smirked as I allowed him to do so. The last time Davin had done such a thing, it did not work out so well for him, as he had woken up staring at the clouds with a sore forehead from my elbow. I blocked Garland's right hook with my armored forearm, immediately going into a Superman elbow to knock him out as I did against Davin, and then I followed by immediately rolling on the back of my opponent. As I hit the ground with a perfect posture, the breath finally left Garland's lungs as his hands dropped his sword and shield. He immediately began wheezing while trying to suck air back into his lungs. Okay, I cheated a little. I promptly admitted. Since I didn't want to cause real damage in order to knock him out, I instead opted for practicing my monk's feature, the stunning strike. If Garland had been able to do anything other than focus on breathing in that moment, he would have heard a chorus of laughs mixed with the ooze of sympathy. Before I could deliver the finishing blow, the young Tyrell was on his knees and elbows facing the earth when he finally took that sweet, sweet breath of fresh air for what seemed to have felt like years. To him it must have felt like drinking a glass of water after a week in a desert, or some weird comparison like that. Alright, the match is over. The master-at-arms declared to everyone after recovering from his surprise and came in between us. Take my advice, work on your stamina. I told him while swirling my sword before sheathing it and stretching my shield arm. Otherwise, be sure that no skill will help you survive an opportunistic opponent. While Garland gave the best approximation of a thumbs up he could in his current condition, I received compliments from Willis and the others, who were all surprised by my previous stunt. Though Davin did seem to notice the move I used on him as a prince, he probably attributed it to the fact that I must have been receiving combat lectures from my knight persona. It was the most logical answer anyway. In all honesty, my brother is no stranger to defeat. Willis conceded while trying his best to not laugh at Garland's expense. But I can't recall watching him receive such a definitive beating. There's no doubt the foreigner is impressive in combat. Sandor nodded, still surprised by my agility and strength despite heavy equipment. He's mightier than he looks. I raised an eyebrow at that. Were you sleeping during the tournament back on King's Landing? Even though I didn't show it that oftenly, in my original body I already had an actual rock-hard six-pack abs, which was a stark improvement in comparison to my previous life if my memory didn't deceive me. Right now, as knight, I was just as tall as you, Clegane. I thought, is that merely bravado or confidence? I clearly defeated you while still dealing with Davin. In any case, after switching back to my appearance as Crown Prince, we waited until Garland had fully recovered from his exhaustion and Willis proceeded to walk me back to my chamber. I've come with the intention of spending the fortnight on Highgarden and bonding with the Tyrells, but was a little surprised after hearing that the Queen of Thorns wasn't feeling well thanks to the sudden shifts of seasons. I've been meaning to trade words with the female equivalent of Tywin Lannister during all the travel on my way here, you know, in order to make an excellent first impression. One night during my stay at Highgarden, I sneaked into her chambers and did my magic. Ew, not like that. Don't even joke about it. Teasing a 45-years-old Jenna Lannister was one thing, still good enough to be considered a MILF. Olenna Tyrell was already on her 60s, and definitely no longer a GILF material. At least for me. Regardless, after making sure she was sleeping and finding out what was actually wrong with her through my observe skill, I've shifted around all my medical knowledge before considering my healing skills, perks and features. Summoned my unseen servants and had them ready to cast Spare the Dying as a safety measure, since I really desired to interact with the Queen of Thorns in the years to come, while my legerdemain hands aided me with providing any medical care she might require. Thankfully, soon enough her condition stabilized and improved back to regular health. I could have my Twilight Sanctuary doubled down on her health points or just give her one of my healing potions, though my paranoia forced me to cast Detect Magic just in case she was being cursed, charmed or something like it. Half an hour after my arrival, I've left with the old Tyrell feeling much better than she might have even before my birth had messed with this world's seasons. Consider this a favor, my lady. One day I will expect you to pay it back, I mentally remarked before jumping out of her window. My stay at Highgarden was an interesting experience, to be honest. I almost considered staying longer, but I was on a schedule. Besides, my legionnaires were running out of work this close to a great house's castle. In many senses, the Reach itself was nothing short of a fairy tale, though some places were more interesting than others to me. Although the farmlands were well maintained, the frequent winters were noticeably taking their toll on the population. At least to those wise enough to care. Every day there were small folk bustling about the main roads into the castle, and it wasn't even a city. But other than the interesting characters belonging to the Tyrell house, the most interesting part about the castle was the massive godswood that could be easily sighted from any point on the castle grounds. That was where my feet were currently taking me to, as I disguised myself to look like my monk identity. Early this day I had visited once again the Sept, finally earning a new level for my paladin and cleric titles after spending some time praying to the gods in a balm of peace. Merely gaining insight into another fighting style, one I've come to name Blessed Warrior, which focused more in healing and dealing radiant damage. Not mind-blowing, but definitely far from useless. Dinner after that was fabulous, as you would expect from a great lord acting as host to the crown prince they were sworn to. There was beer, wine, pork, chicken, vegetables, and even good-looking wenches and servants roaming the halls. I had left as soon as it was considered polite, leaving Sandor and the other two Lannisters to prepare a few things for my departure tomorrow, intent on exploring the place in case it took me a while to return. Which obviously included visiting the 3 weirwood trees I had Shadow locate for me. Thankfully it was not hard to find my way towards the godswood, one only had to follow the magnificent garden passages. Truth be told, it would be easier to find it even without those to guide me. I evaded being seen getting this close to a weirwood tree for good measure, making me glad for not bringing my undead knight with me. Continuing to follow the path, which was lined with beautiful roses, and other pretty flowers along the way, I had to admit. Lord Tyrell obviously spent a lot of gold and manpower on the upkeep of his godswood, an odd thing for any southern lord. It kind of reminded me of my experience with Raventry Hall, since most of the time, the north was the only region to administer such care. In fact, most southern castles didn't actually call it godswood, but instead just gardens. Obviously, it was because they did not follow nor believed in the old gods. I turned a corner in the garden, and suddenly I could finally see it. Even hear them welcoming me. The 3 singers were indeed large, ancient, and graceful. And given this location's backstory, I would say it was a pretty important place for the religion of the old gods. It's just like I've told you, Master. It's very big, Shadow remarked to me after climbing to my shoulder, sitting there just like Pikachu did to Ash. I've never seen anything like it. It's so beautiful. Indeed, I acknowledged her words while caressing her neck. That's why I wanted to see it for myself. I've also come in order to finally progress my druid title, due to it being a while since I've gained anything from it. Walking up to it, hoping to have hit the jackpot with this visit while also becoming more curious the closer that I got. There was no face carved onto them, which was a worrying sign to me, at first. I reached my right and left hand out to touch the one in the middle, still hearing kind words from them. I wanted to touch them all, to feel my connection with nature grow stronger, so one day I could get any closer to becoming just as, if not more, powerful than the 3-eyed raven. Using my divine and wild points, I activated my balm of peace and starry form, making myself the clear representative of the pact between the old gods and new. Title: Druid has leveled up. Your features have evolved. Feeling a different sensation I had felt after bonding with the previous weirwood trees, I had my hands sliding down from the bark of the tree in the middle and grasped the roots of the other two. Primal strikes. Your attacks in beast form count as magical for the purpose of overcoming resistance and immunity to non-magical attacks and damage. I grinned in satisfaction. Now my wild shapes could overcome both regular and magical types of protection. Great. Oh, and I've just unlocked water-breathing forms. Crab, octopus, seahorse, quipper, giant crab, reef shark, giant frog, giant octopus. Giant frog and octopus. I need to test it out. Having Shadow move around to a safe distance, I turned myself into a giant frog, only to be shocked to confirm that I was just as tall as a grown man. And my jumps. Wow, Shadow exclaimed as I leapt above the trees, shaking the ground on my landing. Why was this form locked behind water-breathing restrictions? Adult frog breath air just like humans. Ignoring that doubt for now, I switched to the shape of a giant octopus and felt as if all the trees suddenly rushed towards me. However, the truth was that I was the one who reached out to them, with my massively long tentacles, studded with barbs and suckers with sharp edges, almost toppling several of them. Shit, I'm even bigger. I mentally shouted before turning back to my humanoid form, as a dragon constellation covered my Valerian features. Shouldn't this shape be named Kraken? Is there even a difference in this world? I questioned myself before shrugging. Perhaps it's a squid. Next was a boost to my wild companion. Mighty Summoner. Creatures that you conjure are more resilient than normal. Any summon or creation made by a spell that you cast gains 2 benefits. The creature appears with more health points than normal and the damage from its natural weapons is considered magical for the purpose of overcoming immunity and resistance to non-magical attacks and damage. This one might be even better. Shadow and my unseen servants just got even cooler. I wonder if it also applies to any weapon I make with minor conjuration. Food for thought. Now, onto my next stop. The 12th of June 2021. The 12th of November 2021. The 6th of March 2022. Hope this chapter is of your liking. Anything you wish to ask or suggest, feel free to do so. Check out my auxiliary chapter if you still haven't. Thanks as always for your attention and please be safe. Any problems with my writing, just point them out and I will correct them as soon as possible. Sorry for the constant delays. Asterisk as for the constant info dumps about the logistics of raising and maintaining a personal army, I will stop with them for a while since most of you seem to not enjoy it that much. Cold sweat smile. I'm aware that my writing skills aren't that high to make it more of a pleasant reading experience. Sorry if it really bothered you. Shout out to both fics. The latter, by Twubs, at fanfiction.com and Purple Days, by Varus, at forums.spacebattles.com. Really digging both stories. Your gift is the motivation for my creation. Give me more motivation. Creation is hard, cheer me up. Vote for me. I tagged this book, come and support me with a thumbs up. Like it, add to library, have some idea about my story. Comment it and let me know. Daichi_TBR 193 Creators Thoughts.